Dwayne Johnson, known worldwide for his larger-than-life persona and unshakable confidence, was about to face a situation he hadn't planned for. The sun was dipping below the horizon, casting a warm orange glow across the street as he walked toward his car after a long day of filming. A typical night, or so he thought. Then, out of nowhere, a group of bikers revved their engines loudly, circling him as if he were just another obstacle in their path. Dwayne's brows furrowed, but he didn't flinch. He'd dealt with confrontations before, countless times, in fact. From the wrestling ring to action-packed movie sets, he'd faced tough guys and dangerous situations. But this felt different. There were 5 of them, each on a roaring motorcycle, leather jackets adorned with patches, their faces hidden behind dark helmets. As they slowed to a stop around him, one of them pulled off his helmet, revealing a grizzled face covered in tattoos. "Hey, Rock," the biker sneered, his voice dripping with mockery. "You think you're tough because you're in movies, huh? Let's see if you're as tough in real life." Dwayne paused, looking around. The street was almost empty, with only the distant sound of a few cars passing by. He wasn't scared, but something about this moment felt off. The air was thick with tension, and the group of bikers weren't just looking to test him. They were looking to break him. "What's the problem, fellas?" Dwayne asked, his voice calm but laced with an edge. "I've got a long day behind me, so unless you've got something important to say, I'm gonna have to ask you to move along." The biker who spoke earlier grinned, a smug expression spreading across his face. "Oh, we've got plenty to say, Rock. Maybe we'll even give you a lesson in what it means to be real tough." A sharp click echoed through the night as another biker flicked his switchblade open. It gleamed under the dim street lights. Dwayne could see the aggression in their eyes now, and it wasn't just about intimidation. It was personal. Dwayne felt his heartbeat pick up, but his mind stayed clear. He'd faced worse than this. He could talk his way out of this, no problem. Or so he thought. But then the unexpected happened. One of the bikers moved forward, closing the distance between them. Dwayne stood still, assessing the situation. This wasn't how he usually handled things. Normally, a simple look or a few words would be enough to make people rethink their actions. But these guys weren't backing down. As the biker got closer, Dwayne's phone buzzed in his pocket. For a moment, he almost ignored it. But then he glanced at the screen. It was a call from someone he hadn't heard from in years, someone who could very well change the course of his life. He raised his hand, signaling for the bikers to hold on. "Just a second," he said, his voice carrying enough authority to make them hesitate. Without waiting for their response, he stepped back, his fingers tapping the screen to answer the call. "Dwayne?" A familiar voice crackled through the speaker, sending a chill down his spine. "We need to talk. Now." Before he could say anything else, the situation outside the circle of bikers went silent. It was as if the world held its breath, waiting for him to make the next move. In that instant, Dwayne felt something stir deep inside. A spark of hope, or perhaps it was just the calm before the storm. He glanced back at the bikers, still encircling him, and then, without a second thought, Dwayne took a deep breath. Whatever came next, it was going to change everything. As the sound of the bikers' engines faded into the background, Dwayne Johnson stood still, phone pressed to his ear, the weight of the call sinking in. Whoever it was on the other end wasn't someone he had expected to hear from anytime soon. "Hello?" He spoke into the phone, his voice steady but tinged with curiosity. A long silence followed before the voice on the other end spoke again. "Dwayne, it's Mason. We need to talk about what's going on. It's bigger than you think." Mason. The name hit Dwayne like a cold wave, memories flooding back. Memories he'd buried long ago. Mason wasn't just a former friend. He was someone who had been with him through thick and thin, someone who had helped him when he was just starting out in the entertainment world. But after a falling out years ago, Dwayne hadn't heard from him. He thought he'd left that chapter behind. "Why now, Mason?" Dwayne asked, his voice cool but with an undercurrent of frustration. "I'm dealing with something complicated." "You're in over your head," Mason replied, the urgency in his tone unmistakable. "This isn't just some random group of bikers. They're connected to something bigger, and if you don't move fast, it'll come down on you harder than you can imagine." Dwayne glanced back at the bikers, still lingering nearby. Their menacing stares were locked on him, but now there was a sense of clarity. Something was wrong with this whole situation. Something beyond just a street confrontation. The flashbacks came flooding in as Dwayne hung up the phone, his mind racing through years of memories that felt like another life. He remembered his struggles growing up in Honolulu, how he had to fight for every opportunity, how he'd always been the underdog. His mother, Ada Johnson, had done her best to raise him and his cousins in a neighborhood where survival often meant strength and resilience. From the time he was a teenager, Dwayne had always dreamed of something bigger. He was a star on the high school football team, a powerhouse with natural athletic talent. But life wasn't all touchdowns and accolades. His father, Rocky Johnson, a wrestler with a reputation in the ring, wasn't around much. The lessons of hard work came from his mom, who worked long hours to make ends meet. When he decided to take his talents to the University of Miami, he did so with one goal: to make it. But it was wrestling that ultimately drew him in, and his wrestling career skyrocketed when he adopted the persona of The Rock. The persona was bigger than life, but it wasn't just an act. It was a reflection of the grit he'd built over years of hard knocks. What Mason didn't know was that Dwayne had carried the lessons from his past into everything he did. He wasn't just The Rock in front of the cameras. He was a man forged in the fires of his early life. And, like his character in the ring, he knew how to take a punch and come back swinging. But right now, as he faced the bikers, Dwayne felt a gnawing sense that this wasn't just about physical strength. It was about something deeper. His rise to fame wasn't just about movies and wrestling. It was about overcoming the odds. But even with everything he'd achieved, Dwayne knew the world wasn't done testing him. This moment, with these bikers, was just the beginning. The call from Mason had reminded him of the ghosts from his past, the people he thought were long gone. But those ghosts had come back to haunt him. The gang of bikers continued to watch him, clearly growing impatient. Dwayne let out a breath, trying to stay calm. As much as he wanted to take them all on, his instincts told him this wasn't the time. There was more to this than just a street altercation, and whatever Mason had to say was the key to understanding what was really going on. "Hey, Rock," one of the bikers called out, snapping Dwayne out of his thoughts. "You gonna stand there all day? Or are we gonna finish this?" Dwayne's jaw tightened. He was standing at a crossroads. He could give in to the situation and let his anger take control, or he could step back, play his cards carefully, and figure out what was really at play here. "You don't know who you're messing with," Dwayne finally said, his voice low but laced with authority. The bikers fell silent at the weight of his words. Dwayne had always been able to command attention, whether it was through his presence in the ring or his roles in the movies. But now, it wasn't about the big, tough guy persona. It was about doing what was right. For the first time in a long while, Dwayne felt like he was no longer in control of his own story. The bikers weren't just challenging his strength. They were challenging the man behind the persona. And that was something Dwayne wasn't going to let slide. The bikers were closing in on him, their engines humming like a warning, the night air thick with tension. Dwayne stood his ground, the weight of the phone call still lingering in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that whatever was happening here with the bikers wasn't just some random encounter. This was a test, but not one of strength. It was a test of will, of patience, and maybe even of character. The lead biker, the one with the tattoos and the smug grin, stepped closer to Dwayne. His eyes were hard, filled with something darker than just disdain. He was trying to provoke Dwayne, to push him into a reaction. "You still think you're tough, huh?" The biker spat, his voice full of venom. "Thought you could just walk through life as the big guy, taking whatever you want. What happens when someone decides they don't care who you are?" Dwayne's jaw tightened, but he didn't flinch. The words stung, but he knew better than to let his emotions get the best of him. He'd faced worse than this: insults, physical threats, betrayal. He'd been through hell and back. But something about this felt personal. He took a step forward, keeping his voice steady. "I'm not here to fight you. But if you want one, I'll give it to you. But that's not the fight I'm worried about right now." The biker laughed, his companions following suit, as if they were in on some private joke. "You're a tough guy, I'll give you that. But you're not tougher than us. You're not gonna scare us off with your pretty words, man. This is our turf." We make the rules here, not you. The biker's words hit a nerve, and Dwayne felt his fists clench at his sides. This wasn't just a confrontation. It was a challenge to everything Dwayne had worked for. The way people viewed him, the way he carried himself, it wasn't just about being physically strong. It was about the image of the unshakable man, the Rock. But now, they were trying to shatter that image, to break him down in front of everyone. He couldn't let that happen. You're right about one thing, Dwayne said, his voice calm but firm. You make the rules here. But what happens when you start messing with the wrong guy? The biker's grin faltered for a split second, and that was enough to make Dwayne feel like he had the upper hand, even if just for a moment. Let's get this over with, Dwayne said, pushing past the biker to walk toward his car. If you've got something to prove, fine. Let's see if you can keep up. He wasn't going to fight them in some street brawl. He wasn't going to play their game. Instead, Dwayne made his move, turning his back on them as a sign of defiance. The bikers weren't expecting that. In fact, they were probably expecting him to be the one to escalate things, either with words or fists. As Dwayne walked toward his car, he heard the roar of engines revving behind him. The bikers were following him, the tension in the air palpable. It was clear now. They weren't just looking to intimidate him, they were looking to break him down, to prove that the man behind the persona wasn't as strong as he appeared. But Dwayne wasn't about to let that happen. He reached his car, his fingers brushing against the door handle, but before he could open it, he heard someone shout from behind. You think you're better than us, huh? Think you can just walk away? Dwayne turned, his face hardening, but his eyes remained cool and collected. No, I don't think I'm better than you, but I know I'm better than this. And you'll realize that, too, when it's over. The lead biker took a step forward, his face twisted in rage. You don't get it, do you? This isn't just some little spat. This is about respect. You don't belong here. Dwayne's fists clenched, and for a moment, he thought about taking a swing. He could take them all on, one by one. But as the situation played out, the moment he'd been dreading arrived. One of the bikers made a sudden move. The sound of a switchblade clicking echoed in the night air, and Dwayne's instincts kicked in. He could see the glint of the blade in the dim light, and in that moment, everything seemed to slow down. The biker lunged at him, the knife aimed for his chest. Dwayne sidestepped quickly, his hand grabbing the biker's wrist, twisting it just enough to force the blade out of his grip. With a swift motion, he shoved the man backward, sending him stumbling onto the pavement. The other bikers hesitated for a split second, clearly caught off guard by the speed and precision with which Dwayne moved. But they didn't back down. Dwayne took a deep breath, his mind racing. This wasn't just a fight anymore. It was a showdown, and every move counted. He couldn't afford to lose control. He had to outthink them, not just outfight them. Enough! Dwayne shouted, his voice booming with authority. You want respect? Earn it, but not like this. The bikers stopped in their tracks, exchanging uncertain glances. For a moment, they seemed to reconsider. But the tension in the air remained thick. Dwayne knew he couldn't keep this up forever. But there was one thing that could turn the tide. Something Mason had warned him about. Something bigger was at play here, and Dwayne was about to find out just how deep this went. The air between Dwayne and the bikers grew heavier, each moment stretching longer than the last. As the lead biker stepped forward, his hands balled into fists, ready to throw the first punch, Dwayne's mind raced. He couldn't keep dancing around this confrontation forever. The bikers weren't going to back down just because he asked them to, and he knew it. But just as things seemed on the verge of exploding into chaos, something unexpected happened. A voice, low and gruff, called out from the alleyway behind the bikers. That's enough, guys. The bikers froze, turning as one to see a tall figure emerge from the shadows. It was a man, wearing a leather jacket, his face obscured by the darkness of the night. But Dwayne could see enough to know that this wasn't just some random passerby. Whoever this was, he had authority. The bikers seemed to recognize him immediately, their attitudes shifting. The lead biker, who had been the most aggressive, took a step back, lowering his fists. What do you want, Frank? He grumbled. The man, Frank, didn't answer right away. Instead, he took a slow, deliberate step forward, his eyes scanning Dwayne for a moment before he spoke again. his voice cool and steady. "You really think this is the way to handle things?" The bikers muttered among themselves, clearly unsure how to respond. It wasn't often they were called out like this, especially by someone like Frank. Dwayne didn't know who this guy was, but he wasn't about to miss an opportunity. He stepped in, his voice low but clear. "I'm not looking for a fight, but if you want to keep going, I'm ready. Just tell me what the hell is going on here." Frank's eyes shifted to Dwayne, and for a moment, they locked eyes. Dwayne could sense there was more to this guy than the typical street tough. Frank didn't seem intimidated, but he also didn't seem to want to escalate things any further. The lead biker muttered something under his breath and then, to Dwayne's surprise, he took a few steps back. "Yeah, whatever. We'll handle this another time," he said, his tone now laced with reluctance. The others followed suit, mounting their bikes and revving their engines. But before they left, the lead biker threw one last glare at Dwayne, his voice filled with warning. "This isn't over, Rock. You'll regret sticking your nose in this." As the bikers disappeared into the night, Dwayne let out a slow breath, his fists still clenched but his body relaxed. He had averted a full-blown fight, but there was no doubt in his mind that whatever they were involved in wasn't something he could walk away from. Dwayne turned to face Frank, who had been watching the bikers leave. The tension in the air started to fade, but Dwayne knew there was still a storm on the horizon. "Who the hell are you?" Dwayne asked, his voice both curious and cautious. Frank smiled a little, the corners of his lips twitching upward. "Name's Frank. I've been keeping an eye on you, Rock." Dwayne hesitated for a moment, but then nodded. Something about Frank seemed genuine. The man wasn't making any sudden moves or demanding anything, and for once, Dwayne didn't feel like he was being pushed into a corner. They made their way into the diner, the bell above the door jingling as they entered. The place was practically empty, save for a lone waitress cleaning a table in the back. The atmosphere was dim, the only light coming from a single fluorescent bulb overhead. Frank slid into a booth and gestured for Dwayne to sit across from him. As Dwayne settled in, the waitress came over, her expression drawn and tired. "What can I get you guys?" she asked in a monotone voice. "A coffee for me," Dwayne said, leaning back against the worn vinyl seat. "Same," Frank replied, his gaze still fixed on Dwayne. The waitress walked off, and the two men were left alone. For a few moments, there was silence between them. Dwayne leaned forward, his fingers tapping lightly on the table. "You're not just some guy who likes to play the hero, are you? What's really going on?" Frank leaned back in his seat, exhaling slowly. "You're smart, Rock. I'll give you that. But the thing is, this isn't a game, and it's bigger than just some street punks with bikes. The people they work for, well, let's just say they're not the kind of folks you want to cross. And you, my friend, have just found yourself in the middle of something way out of your league." Dwayne's brow furrowed. "I don't care who they work for. I'm not about to let them walk all over me." Frank nodded. "I get it, but this isn't just about pride. They've got their hands in things you wouldn't believe, and you're about to find out just how deep it goes. It's time for you to make a choice. Either you walk away and let it go, or you dig in your heels and face whatever's coming your way." The waitress returned with their coffee, placing the cups down without saying a word. As she walked away, Frank took a sip of his coffee, his eyes never leaving Dwayne's. Dwayne leaned back, his mind working through everything Frank had said. He was used to taking risks, used to stepping into the unknown. But this felt different. Something about Frank's warning didn't sit well with him, and he could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. The world wasn't just testing his strength anymore. It was testing his resolve. And this time, it wasn't just about surviving. It was about figuring out who he could trust and what he was willing to fight for. "So what's the next move?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady, the fire in his eyes beginning to burn brighter. Frank smirked, his gaze hardening. "The next move is yours, Rock, but you better be ready." The clink of ceramic cups filled the silence between Dwayne and Frank. The coffee was bitter, much like the situation Dwayne found himself in. The diner's faded neon sign buzzed in the distance, the only sound besides the occasional hum of the air conditioning. Frank hadn't offered any more details since his cryptic warning. Dwayne's mind was still racing, trying to piece everything together. "So," Dwayne finally broke the silence, leaning forward, his elbows resting on the table. You've made your point. You say these bikers are just the tip of the iceberg. But what's the real story here, Frank? Who's pulling their strings? Frank set his coffee down, eyes narrowing. He studied Dwayne for a moment before responding, his voice low. It's not just bikers, Rock. They're part of something much bigger, an underground network of criminals tied to organized crime. Drugs, weapons, extortion, you name it. And it goes way up the chain. The bikers you just encountered? They're working for a guy named Marino. The name hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. He'd heard of Marino before. Whispers in the media, rumors of his name tied to everything shady, from illicit deals to underground fight rings. Marino was a ghost, always one step ahead of the law. And now it seemed like he was pulling the strings of the very people Dwayne was trying to avoid. Marino? Dwayne repeated, his voice growing cold. I've heard of him. Never thought I'd have to deal with his people. Frank's lips curled into a tight smile, though there was no humor in it. Yeah, well, now you're in the thick of it. And it's not just about you, Rock. It's about the people around you. Marino doesn't care who gets hurt in the process. If you keep pushing, he'll make sure it's not just your name on the line. Dwayne's mind flashed back to the bikers, the way they'd mocked him, pushed his buttons. He couldn't just let this slide. He'd spent years building his reputation, his career. But now, the weight of the threat seemed much heavier. So, what's the play here? You think I can just walk away from this? Dwayne asked, his voice hardening. I've never been one to turn my back on a fight, especially when I'm being threatened. Frank took a slow, deliberate sip of his coffee before answering. You don't walk away, but you need to be careful about how you approach this. Marino isn't someone you can just muscle through. He's got influence, resources, and he knows how to make people disappear. It's not about strength anymore. It's about strategy, alliances, and knowing who to trust. The words sank in, and Dwayne let out a breath, his mind racing. The idea of being pulled into a world of crime and corruption didn't sit well with him. He'd spent too much of his life fighting for the right things. But now, everything was tangled up in something darker than he'd ever imagined. You said I need to make a choice, Dwayne said, his gaze locked on Frank. Well, I've made it. I'm not backing down, but I need more than just threats. What's Marino really after? And why drag me into this? Frank's eyes darkened, and he leaned forward slightly. Marino's got a lot of operations running under the radar, but there's something bigger at play. There's been talk of a major deal, something that could change the entire landscape of his business. And you? You're part of that deal. Dwayne raised an eyebrow, confused. Me? I'm not in the game. I'm an actor, a wrestler. I don't do deals with criminals. Frank nodded, but there was no sympathy in his expression. That's what you think. But Marino's got a way of pulling people into his world. He's been watching you, Rock. Watching your rise, your influence, your power. You've got something he wants, whether you know it or not. And now, you're a part of his game, whether you like it or not. Dwayne felt the tension build in his chest. He had always been a man of action, a man who faced challenges head-on. But now, this felt different. He wasn't just fighting for respect or survival anymore. He was fighting for his freedom. So, what do I do now? Dwayne asked, his voice steady but filled with frustration. You're telling me I can't fight my way out of this, but I don't know how to play the game any other way? Frank's face softened, just for a moment. You need allies, people who know how to navigate this world. You can't take on Marino by yourself, and if you want to stay alive, you need to understand the rules of the game. We'll figure out a way to get you out of this, but it's going to take time, and it's going to take trust. Trust? Dwayne echoed. Who do I trust? You? Frank looked at him, his expression unreadable. I know you're skeptical. Hell, I'd be too if I were in your shoes. But I'm the one who's been watching the bikers, the ones working for Marino. And I'm the one who's going to help you stay ahead of him. Dwayne sat back, processing what Frank had said. The situation had escalated from a simple confrontation with some bikers to something much larger and far more dangerous. Marino wasn't just some petty thug. He was a criminal mastermind with a network of people at his disposal. And Dwayne had somehow become entangled in it. I don't trust easily, Frank, Dwayne said, his voice hard, but there was a hint of doubt in his eyes. But right now, it looks like you're my best shot. Frank leaned back in his seat, crossing his arms. Then let's get to work. But remember, Rock, this won't be easy. And there's no going back once we start. The weight of Frank's words hung in the air like a storm cloud, dark and suffocating. Dwayne's thoughts spun in chaotic circles. The promise of his freedom now seemed a distant hope, obscured by a criminal underworld that stretched farther than he had ever imagined. He wasn't sure if he could trust Frank, but he also didn't have many options left. The idea of being a pawn in some grand game wasn't something he had planned for, but there was no denying that he was now in the thick of it. Frank stood up from the booth, his chair scraping against the floor as he moved toward the counter. He paid for their coffees without saying another word. Dwayne watched him, his mind still processing everything. He had been in sticky situations before. Bad deals, enemies in the ring, and those who wanted to use him for their own gain. But this felt different. This wasn't just about money or fame. This was about survival. His survival. You ready? Frank's voice broke through his thoughts, and Dwayne looked up to find him holding the door open, a serious look on his face. Dwayne took a deep breath, standing up and pushing his chair back. He could feel the weight of the decision on his shoulders, but there was no turning back now. The choices were clear. He either bowed out, leaving everyone behind, or he fought. And Dwayne Johnson never backed down from a fight. Let's do it, Dwayne said, his voice steady, his resolve hardening. Frank nodded, and they both stepped out into the cool night air. The sound of the diner's door closing behind them echoed in the empty street as they made their way to a black SUV parked across the street. Dwayne followed Frank without a word, his eyes scanning their surroundings for anything out of place. Every step felt heavier, every decision carrying more weight. Frank unlocked the SUV with a quick press of a button and opened the door for Dwayne. Once inside, the vehicle hummed to life, and they were off. The streets passed by in a blur of lights and shadows, the city a constant pulse beneath them. So, what now? Dwayne asked, breaking the silence. He couldn't help but feel like he was being drawn into something that would change his life in ways he wasn't prepared for. We meet with a few people, Frank answered, his gaze fixed ahead. I've got some contacts who can help you, but you need to be careful. Marino's got eyes everywhere. You don't know who to trust. Dwayne nodded, glancing out the window. He was used to being the center of attention, the one in the spotlight, but this was different. This world was a web of deceit and danger. If he was going to survive it, he needed to play by its rules. For the first time in his life, Dwayne wasn't sure if his strength alone would be enough to get him out of this. The car made a sharp turn, and they entered a quieter part of the city. As they pulled up to a warehouse, Dwayne's instincts kicked in. The place was dark, its exterior cold and industrial. It didn't look like a spot for friendly meetings. This was the kind of place where shady deals went down, where no one asked questions. Frank parked the SUV and turned to Dwayne. Stay close, and don't do anything stupid. These people are dangerous, but they can help you. Dwayne's eyes narrowed. Help me? How? By giving you a chance to level the playing field, Frank said, his tone serious. But you need to listen carefully. Don't try to show off or make any grand gestures. Right now, you're a nobody to them. Prove that you're worth their time. Dwayne didn't need any more convincing. He'd faced down bigger opponents, walked into tougher situations. But this was different. The rules weren't clear, and the stakes were higher than anything he'd ever imagined. The two men exited the SUV and walked toward the warehouse's entrance. Frank led the way, his footsteps sure and steady. Dwayne followed, each step echoing in the silence of the night. They were met at the door by a tall man in a suit, his face unreadable. He didn't say anything as he gestured for them to follow him inside. The warehouse was dimly lit, the air thick with the smell of old wood and dust. At the far end of the room, a long table was surrounded by several figures, all of them watching Dwayne and Frank as they approached. Dwayne's pulse quickened, but he kept his expression neutral. This wasn't about intimidation. It was about survival. Frank gestured for Dwayne to sit at one end of the table, while he took a seat across from him. The people around the table didn't speak at first. Instead, They studied Dwayne, their eyes sharp, assessing. Finally, one of them, a man in his mid-40s with a scar running down his cheek, spoke up. So, you're the guy who thinks he can take on Marino. Dwayne didn't flinch. I'm not here to take on anyone. I'm here because I've got a problem, and I need it solved. The man with the scar leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping rhythmically on the table. We all have problems, kid. The question is, how far are you willing to go to solve yours? Dwayne didn't hesitate. As far as it takes. The man's lips curled into a slight smile. We'll see about that. Another figure at the table, a woman with dark hair and piercing eyes, spoke next. We can help you, but you'll have to prove you're worth the risk. This isn't just about getting your hands dirty. It's about understanding the game and playing it smart. Dwayne looked around the table, taking in the faces of the people who were now part of his world. They were all in it for their own reasons. But the one thing they had in common was the same dark world Dwayne had found himself tangled in. Frank glanced at Dwayne, his eyes unreadable. This is your chance, Rock. Take it or leave it. Dwayne took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was the first time he was truly uncertain, but he knew one thing for sure. If he walked away now, Marino would come for him, and it wouldn't just be his life on the line. He looked at the people around the table, the people who held the power to shape his fate. With a steady voice, he spoke, I'm in. Let's make a deal. The room in the warehouse was silent after Dwayne's declaration. The people around the table studied him, as though weighing his words. Frank, who had been standing by the door, exchanged a brief glance with the scarred man before nodding slightly. It seemed like a signal, though Dwayne couldn't be sure what it meant. The woman with piercing eyes, who had spoken earlier, stood up slowly. She was tall, her movements deliberate. She wore a black leather jacket, and her demeanor was cold, calculating. She looked Dwayne up and down before speaking. You're confident. I'll give you that, she said, her voice even, almost emotionless. But confidence won't get you through this. You want to survive, to take down Marino? You need to understand the rules of his world. We can help you, but it's going to take more than just brute force. Dwayne held her gaze. I didn't get to where I am by backing down. I don't plan to start now. The woman nodded, seemingly satisfied with his response. Good. You'll need that mindset. But Marino? He's not the kind of guy you can just beat into submission. He's too smart for that. His empire runs on manipulation, information, and control. He's always one step ahead. Dwayne's mind raced, but he kept his face neutral. Then I'll need to be 2 steps ahead. The scarred man, who had been silent up until now, chuckled. That's the spirit. But it's not going to be easy. Marino's people? They're everywhere. And trust me, you don't want to underestimate anyone who works for him. They don't fear anyone. Frank stepped forward, his voice cutting through the tension. That's why we've been keeping an eye on you. We know you've got the strength, but now you've got to think. You've got to play the long game. Dwayne's mind shifted gears. He'd been used to thinking on his feet, using his instincts to guide him in the ring and on screen. But this was different. This was a game of shadows, deception, and cold calculation. He couldn't just throw punches and hope for the best. The woman spoke again, this time with more urgency. Marino's empire is built on secrecy. He controls everything, and he has ears everywhere. He's got his fingers in every illegal business imaginable, but his real power lies in something else, his ability to make people disappear. Dwayne's brow furrowed. Disappear? What does that even mean? Frank answered for her, his voice low. People who get in Marino's way, people who threaten his empire, they vanish. No warning, no trace. And Marino doesn't hesitate. He's ruthless. Dwayne leaned forward, his hands resting on the edge of the table. So, what's the play? How do I take him down without getting myself erased? The scarred man, who hadn't said much but seemed to be the leader of the group, spoke again. You don't just take him down. You find out what he's hiding. You expose him. That's the key. Marino's got a lot of dirty secrets, but he's very careful about what gets out. If you can uncover his vulnerabilities, his weaknesses, then you can strike. Dwayne's eyes narrowed. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him. This wasn't about taking on a single enemy anymore. This was about unraveling a massive network, a criminal empire that had taken years to build. He would have to be methodical, strategic, and more patient than he had ever been before. "You're telling me to dig up dirt on him?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady but filled with skepticism. "That's the plan?" "Not just any dirt," Frank replied, his tone sharp. "You need to find something that'll bring the whole thing crashing down. And you can't do it alone. Marino has people everywhere. You need allies, people who can help you get to him. That's why you're here." Dwayne looked around the table, taking in the faces of those who had offered their assistance. These were people who had lived in the shadows for years. They weren't afraid to get their hands dirty. But Dwayne? He was used to being in the spotlight, to fighting for what he believed in, not for hidden secrets and dangerous leverage. "Where do we start?" Dwayne asked, his voice low, focused. He'd made his choice. There was no going back now. The scarred man looked at him with a glint in his eye, his expression unreadable. "We've been tracking Marino's movements for months. There's a place, a safe house, where he conducts some of his business, deals that are too sensitive to happen in public. It's heavily guarded, but if we can infiltrate it, we might be able to uncover something big, something that will make him vulnerable." Dwayne nodded. "I'm in. Let's go." The woman with the dark eyes stepped in again, her tone colder than before. "You'll need to stay under the radar. This isn't a fight you can win with brute force. The moment you start making waves, Marino will know we're coming." The team began to move, gathering their things and preparing to leave. Dwayne felt a rush of adrenaline as he followed them outside into the night. He didn't know exactly what they had in store for him, but he was ready to step into this dark world and fight his way through it. As they reached the cars, Frank turned to Dwayne, his expression serious. "This is the beginning, Rock. Once we make our move, there's no turning back. You need to be ready for whatever comes next." Dwayne nodded, his resolve hardening. "I've been ready." The night air was thick with anticipation as Dwayne and the small group of allies drove through the city's maze of winding streets. His mind was still grappling with the sheer scale of the task ahead. They weren't just going after a few bikers. They were about to take on the very heart of an empire built on fear, manipulation, and ruthless efficiency. They had made their way to the outskirts of the city, where the safe house was located. Dwayne's thoughts drifted to the people he cared about, the ones who didn't know what he was getting into, the ones who would be at risk if this went south. He had no choice now but to see it through. The bikers had made their threats, and now Marino's reach had extended far beyond just a few dangerous faces. This was a battle that could cost him everything if he wasn't careful. Frank sat beside him in the SUV, his face serious as he navigated the streets. The others in the car were silent, focused on the mission at hand. The weight of their collective determination hung in the air, and even Dwayne, usually so comfortable in the spotlight, felt like an outsider to the world of shadows they inhabited now. "We're almost there," Frank said, his voice breaking the silence. "Stick to the plan. In and out, fast. We need intel, nothing more." Dwayne nodded. "Got it." They pulled into a dimly lit alleyway, the safe house's location nestled between two nondescript buildings. It was a perfect spot for a clandestine operation, far enough from the eyes of the law, but close enough to be strategic. Dwayne's pulse quickened. Every step from here on out mattered. If they were caught, the consequences would be severe. Everything they'd worked for would go up in smoke. They parked the vehicle a few blocks away from the safe house and began their approach on foot. The city's noise faded into the background, replaced by the sharp sound of their footsteps on cracked pavement. Frank led the way, followed by Dwayne and the others. There was no time for hesitation. The building was large, but it wasn't heavily fortified. A few guards stood watch outside, but they were spread thin, probably assuming no one would dare try anything here. It was an oversight that Dwayne intended to exploit. They moved quickly, using the shadows to conceal their movements. The group's professionalism was evident. Every move was calculated, every action deliberate. They reached the side door, which was slightly ajar. Frank signaled for Dwayne to stay low, and the group slipped inside without making a sound. The interior of the safe house was cold and sterile, its white walls stark and uninviting. It was clear that this place wasn't used for comfort. It was a place for deals, exchanges, and and everything else that went on behind closed doors in Marino's world. They moved cautiously through the hallways, staying close to the walls and listening for any signs of movement. Dwayne's senses were heightened, his body tensed and ready to react at a moment's notice. This wasn't a fight he was used to, but he'd learned over the years to rely on instinct when it came to situations like this. At the end of the hallway, they reached a large room. Frank paused, holding up a hand to signal the group to stop. They could hear voices coming from the other side. Low murmurs, but clearly discussing something important. Dwayne's heart pounded in his chest. This was it. The woman with the dark eyes, whose name Dwayne still didn't know, pulled out a small device from her bag. It was a recorder designed to pick up conversations through walls. She placed it carefully against the door, listening intently for any valuable information. Minutes passed like hours, and Dwayne's patience began to wear thin. He wanted to move, to get in there and get the answers he needed. But Frank's command had been clear. This was about precision, not rash action. Finally, the woman lowered the device and turned to Frank. They're talking about a shipment. It's due to go out tomorrow night. Large hall, a lot of people involved. Marino's making moves, trying to expand his operation. Dwayne's eyes narrowed. This was the kind of intel they needed. Where's it coming from? Who's involved? I don't know yet, the woman replied. But this is big. Marino's planning something. Something that could shift the entire balance of power. If we can get more information about this shipment, it could give us the leverage we need to move against him. Dwayne's mind raced. This wasn't just about disrupting one part of Marino's operation anymore. This was a much bigger deal, one that could unravel the entire network if they played it right. Then let's get in there, Dwayne said, his voice low but determined. We need to know more. Now. Frank held up a hand to stop him. No, we don't rush in. We stick to the plan. Dwayne's frustration bubbled up, but he managed to hold it in. Then what's the next step? Frank's eyes locked with Dwayne's. We need to split up. You'll take the east wing with me. The rest of the team will cover the west side. We gather intel, plant tracking devices, and get out before anyone knows we were here. The plan was risky, but it was their best chance. If they could get the right intel, they could potentially track Marino's movements, learn his next moves, and disrupt his operations. The group split off into two teams, and Dwayne moved silently down the hall with Frank, his mind sharp, focused. Every door they passed, every hallway they turned down, he felt the weight of the mission pressing on him. This was more than just taking down Marino. It was about protecting the life he had built and making sure that no one, not even Marino, could take that away from him. As they reached the east wing, Frank stopped in front of a door. In here. We need to get this done quickly. Dwayne nodded, his heart racing. He knew that this was the moment that could change everything. If they succeeded here, they'd have a chance to bring Marino down. If they failed, well, they wouldn't leave the safe house alive. Frank nodded at the door, and Dwayne took a deep breath. It was time to make their move. The door creaked as Frank pushed it open, and Dwayne followed him inside with the quiet precision of someone who had spent years in front of the camera, but was now forced to operate in a world far darker than anything he had ever known. The room was dimly lit, its furnishings sparse and cold. A large desk sat at the center, surrounded by files, papers, and a laptop that hummed softly in the background. This was a place of business, but not the kind Dwayne was accustomed to. Stay sharp, Frank whispered, his eyes scanning the room. We don't know how many people are here, and Marino's men could be watching these offices. Let's move fast. Dwayne nodded, his gaze flicking around the space. He felt a buzz of adrenaline, the kind that had always coursed through him before a big match. But this time, it wasn't the thrill of victory on the line. This was a different kind of fight, one where failure meant far more than a lost title. The first step was clear. Gather intel. Dwayne moved toward the desk while Frank began checking the corners of the room. There were papers everywhere, but Dwayne wasn't looking for just any information. He was searching for something concrete, something that would make Marino vulnerable. His fingers brushed over the files scattered on the desk. Most of them were business-related, transactions, contracts, but then he saw it. A folder, slightly out of place, as though it had been shoved aside quickly. He opened it with one smooth motion, scanning its contents. His heart skipped a beat. Inside were names, lots of them, along with dates, locations, and details of secret shipments that weren't just about drugs or weapons. There were people involved, high-profile individuals, government officials. The names seemed to range from corrupt city politicians to members of local law enforcement. "This is it," Dwayne muttered under his breath, his pulse quickening. "Marino's got people everywhere." Frank, who had been checking the laptop, turned toward him. "What did you find?" "Corruption, power plays, and a whole network," Dwayne said, his voice low. "This isn't just about illegal shipments. Marino's got ties to the city's upper echelon. He's working with people who could protect him, people who could make sure he never gets caught." Frank walked over, his expression grim as he looked at the papers. He reached over and slid the folder back into place, out of sight. "We need to be careful. If Marino catches wind that we've uncovered this, it's game over. He's ruthless, and he's got eyes everywhere." Dwayne could feel the weight of the information they just found, but he also knew they were running out of time. "What now?" Frank didn't hesitate. "Now, we get out. We've got what we came for. We know what Marino's hiding, and we can use it to tear him apart. But we need to move fast before he figures out what we're doing." Dwayne nodded. He could already hear footsteps approaching in the hall. He didn't need to say anything. Frank's sharp instincts had already picked up on it. The window of opportunity was closing fast. But just as they started to turn toward the exit, the door to the room slammed open. A tall man, dressed in black and carrying a gun, stepped inside. His eyes locked onto Dwayne, and then to Frank. He didn't speak at first, his cold expression betraying nothing. "Looks like you're a little too curious for your own good," the man said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. Dwayne's instincts kicked in. He wasn't about to be caught off guard. He had been in tight spots before, under pressure, on the brink of losing everything. But this time, he wasn't just fighting for a title. He was fighting for his life, for the lives of those he cared about. Frank didn't flinch. "This isn't the time for games. We don't want trouble." The man raised an eyebrow. "And yet, you're in my office, looking at things you shouldn't be. I think that counts as trouble." Dwayne stepped forward, his fists clenched, ready to fight if it came to that. But Frank held up a hand, signaling for him to stand down. The tension in the room was thick, but Frank's calm demeanor seemed to throw the man off, even if just for a moment. "We weren't trying to start anything," Frank said, his voice low and even. "We were just looking for information. Information you wouldn't want getting out." The man's eyes flicked toward Dwayne, studying him for a long, unsettling moment. Then, without warning, he stepped aside and motioned toward the door. "You've got 5 minutes to get out of here before I make a call. If I were you, I'd take the deal." Dwayne didn't need to be told twice. He nodded at Frank, who gave him a brief, unreadable look. Without another word, they moved toward the door, keeping their pace steady but cautious. The man didn't make a move to stop them, but Dwayne knew it wasn't over yet. Not by a long shot. As they stepped into the hallway, Frank glanced at Dwayne, his expression tight. "We can't go back to the same path. They know we're here, and now we've got to lay low for a while. They'll be hunting us, and we don't want to give them any reason to speed things up." Dwayne's mind was already racing with the implications of what they had uncovered. If Marino had people in every corner of the city, if his reach extended this far, how could they even begin to fight back? Frank's voice broke through his thoughts. "Listen, we need to meet someone. A contact. They can help us move in a way Marino won't see coming." "A contact?" Dwayne asked, raising an eyebrow. "We're trusting anyone else right now?" "I trust them more than Marino," Frank replied. "They've got the resources to keep us safe, and the connections to help us get closer to Marino without alerting him. But we need to move fast. The clock's ticking." Dwayne didn't argue. He didn't have the luxury of questioning Frank's decisions. Not anymore. They moved swiftly through the building's back halls, making their way to a side exit. The tension between them was palpable, but they had no choice but to keep going. Every step they took in this world brought them deeper into a dangerous game, one where the rules weren't just blurred, they were non-existent. As they reached the door, Dwayne stopped and looked back at the building. He couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched, but he pushed the thought aside. He had no choice now. He couldn't back out. Frank put a hand on his shoulder. We're not done yet. We're just getting started. The night was thick with tension as Dwayne and Frank made their way down the quiet, narrow streets, blending in with the shadows. The adrenaline from their close call still surged through Dwayne's veins, but there was no time to revel in their narrow escape. They needed to move faster, to keep one step ahead of Marino's men who would undoubtedly be searching for them. The contact Frank spoke of was someone they couldn't afford to trust blindly, but they had no choice. This was their best shot at getting the leverage they needed to bring down Marino without exposing themselves any further. Dwayne could feel the weight of the mission pressing down on him, the lives of those close to him, his own future, all hanging by a thread. The city's familiar skyline loomed in the distance as they approached an old warehouse district on the outskirts of town. The buildings here were abandoned, silent monuments to a bygone era. Frank had told Dwayne that their contact was hiding in plain sight, but there was a certain unease in the air, one that Dwayne couldn't shake. "Keep your guard up," Frank said, his voice low. "This person doesn't trust easily. If they even suspect we're not who we say we are, it'll be the end of this." Dwayne nodded, his mind still racing. "I didn't expect any easy answers. But if we're going to take down Marino, we need all the help we can get." Frank's eyes were narrowed as he scanned the surroundings. "Exactly. And this contact, let's just say they've been in the game longer than we have. They know how to play it without getting caught." The dim glow of a single street lamp flickered as they approached the old, rusted door of a warehouse. Frank stopped in front of it and knocked twice, quickly, in a rhythmic pattern. Dwayne glanced at him, eyebrows raised. "Are we sure this is the right place?" Dwayne asked, though he had little doubt. The look on Frank's face told him that it was. Before Frank could respond, a soft click sounded from the other side, and the door creaked open just enough for them to slip inside. Inside, the room was dark, save for a few low-hanging bulbs that bathed the place in an eerie glow. The walls were lined with crates and boxes, stacked high as if the warehouse had once been used for storage and never emptied. There was a distinct scent of dust and metal in the air, but it wasn't empty. Someone was waiting. A figure stepped forward from the shadows, their silhouette cutting a sharp contrast against the dim lighting. The figure was tall, clad in a dark trench coat, and their face was partially obscured by the collar turned up against the cold. "You must be Frank," the figure said, their voice smooth, almost clinical. It was a woman's voice, but cold, void of any warmth. "And you must be the famous Dwayne Johnson." Dwayne instinctively tensed at the mention of his name. He didn't like being recognized in this environment. It meant people were watching. People were talking. Frank didn't flinch. "That's right. You're the one who can help us." The woman studied Dwayne for a moment longer, then her eyes flicked to Frank. "I can help, but I don't do favors. You'll pay for what you need, one way or another." Dwayne could feel the intensity in the room, the pressure building with every passing second. There was no room for negotiation. They were already too deep in this game to back out. But the woman was right. This wasn't about charity. It never had been. "We don't have time for games," Frank said, his voice low but firm. "Marino's empire is on the brink of collapse, and we need the tools to bring it down." The woman's eyes narrowed, her gaze flicking over to Dwayne. She seemed to size him up, calculating whether or not he was worth the effort. After a beat, she stepped aside and motioned for them to follow her deeper into the warehouse. "Follow me. But keep in mind, I'm not handing you anything without a price." Dwayne followed Frank and the woman into the heart of the warehouse. The deeper they went, the more Dwayne could sense the complexity of this world. This woman, this contact, was part of a network that spanned far beyond the usual criminals and lowlifes. She operated in a realm of high-stakes information, hidden deals, and people who didn't hesitate to erase anyone who got in their way. They reached a small room at the back of the warehouse, where a massive computer screen blinked to life at the woman's command. The room smelled of stale air and coffee, but there was something far more important at play. On the screen, a web of names, locations, and figures began to appear, each one connected to Marino and his illegal network. "This is what you came for," the woman said, her voice now colder than before. "I've been tracking Marino for years. I know his every move. The problem is, He's always 2 steps ahead. Dwayne leaned in, eyes scanning the data. There were records, logs, encrypted messages, evidence that Marino's operation was vast, sprawling across multiple countries. Dwayne could already feel the pieces coming together, but the complexity of it all overwhelmed him. How could they even begin to dismantle this? Where do we start? Dwayne asked, his voice steady despite the mounting pressure. The woman's gaze shifted from the screen to Dwayne. We start by finding his weak link. There's always one. Someone who knows too much or someone Marino trusts too much. That's your way in. Frank stepped forward, his face grim. And how do we find this person? The woman didn't hesitate. There's a delivery coming in tonight, Marino's biggest shipment yet. It's happening at the docks, and it's the perfect opportunity to get close. But you'll need to move fast. If Marino figures out we're onto him, it's game over for all of us. Dwayne turned to Frank, his mind already calculating the next move. This was it, the opening they'd been waiting for. They could infiltrate the docks, gather intel, and maybe, just maybe, find that weak link. All right, let's do this, Dwayne said, determination settling over him like armor. The woman nodded, her lips curling into a faint, almost knowing smile. I'll provide you with the intel, but after tonight, we'll be square. Don't come asking for more favors. With that, she turned off the screen and handed Frank a flash drive loaded with the data they needed. Dwayne took one last look around the dim warehouse before he followed Frank out, the weight of their mission pressing heavily on his shoulders. As they stepped back into the cool night air, Dwayne felt the tension in his chest tighten. They were about to confront Marino's operation head-on, and this was only the beginning. But the deeper they went, the more they would risk. This game wasn't just about taking down an empire. It was about survival. The night air was cold and biting as Dwayne and Frank sped through the city streets, the distant hum of the engine the only sound accompanying their tense silence. The flash drive they had secured from the mysterious contact was burning a hole in Dwayne's pocket, its contents a map of Marino's network. But none of that mattered right now. What did matter was the shipment. Tonight, the chance to strike at the heart of Marino's empire. Frank glanced over at Dwayne as they turned a corner, his face set in grim determination. You ready for this? We don't have the luxury of taking it slow. Dwayne didn't answer right away, his mind focused on the task ahead. He could feel the weight of their situation. The stakes had never been higher. One wrong move and everything they'd worked for could collapse. But he had no choice. He was already too deep in this to back out now. I'm ready, Dwayne finally said, his voice steady. Let's end this. Frank nodded, and they drove in silence for the next few miles. The docks weren't far, but in a city like this, they were the most dangerous place to be at night. Warehouses lined the edge of the water, the air thick with the smell of salt and rust. The sounds of heavy machinery and ships unloading goods echoed through the mist, but beneath it all, there was an oppressive stillness, a waiting, a quiet before the storm. As they neared the docks, Frank pulled off the main road and parked the car in the shadows, out of sight. Dwayne scanned the area as he stepped out, his muscles coiled and ready for whatever came next. They were in enemy territory now. Stay close, Frank said, his voice low. We're going in quiet. No unnecessary moves. Dwayne nodded, following Frank as they made their way through the maze of crates and darkened alleyways. The docks were a sprawling labyrinth, but Frank had been here enough times to know the lay of the land. They moved quickly, with purpose, keeping to the shadows. They reached a small, unmarked door at the back of one of the warehouses. Frank knocked twice, soft, deliberate, and after a brief pause, the door creaked open. A man in a heavy coat stood there, his face hard and unyielding. Frank, the man said, his voice gruff. You made it. Dwayne's eyes scanned the man quickly, taking in the way he stood, alert, prepared, a professional in a world of amateurs. This was their contact on the ground, someone who could get them inside the operation without alerting Marino's men. This is Dwayne, Frank introduced. He's here to help. We need to move fast. The man nodded and stepped aside, letting them into the warehouse. The inside was dark and smelled of oil and metal, the faint sound of machinery in the distance. The place was a beehive of activity, people moving in and out, loading and unloading crates, but there was something off about it all. The air felt charged with danger, as if something was about to go terribly wrong. "We have eyes on the shipment," the contact said as he led them further into the building. "It's coming in on the next boat. I've got a team in place, but we're stretched thin. If we're going to get what we need, we'll have to move quickly." Dwayne's eyes narrowed. "What's the plan?" The contact handed him a small set of blueprints, the lines and markings showing the layout of the warehouse and surrounding area. "The shipment's coming in from the north docks. We'll have about 15 minutes to intercept it before Marino's men take it deeper into the city. We need to get to it before they do." Frank studied the blueprints, his mind already calculating their next moves. "We'll split up. Dwayne, you take the left side with me. Our contact will cover the right. Stay low, stay quiet, and don't draw attention. We don't know who else is here." Dwayne gave a sharp nod, his heart pounding in his chest. Every step they took toward the shipment was a step deeper into Marino's grip. He could almost feel the eyes of Marino's men watching them, waiting for them to make a mistake. They moved out, the cold concrete beneath their boots echoing through the warehouse as they carefully navigated toward the north docks. The shadows seemed to grow longer as they crept closer, the faint sound of water lapping against the docks mingling with the hurried footfalls of the workers around them. Everything felt surreal, like they were in the middle of a well-choreographed dance, but one wrong step could turn it into chaos. "Stay alert," Frank muttered as they neared the loading dock. "This is where it gets tricky." Just as they rounded the corner, the sound of engines roared to life in the distance. Dwayne's instincts kicked in. He knew what was coming. The shipment was about to arrive. They couldn't afford to waste any more time. Frank motioned for him to stay low as they crept toward the edge of the loading area. Through the cracks in the crates, Dwayne could see the silhouette of a large cargo ship approaching, its lights shining like a beacon in the fog. The anticipation in the air was thick, the moment of truth quickly approaching. "Get ready," Frank whispered. "When that ship docks, we move." The ship's engines slowed, and Dwayne could see the figures of men on board, moving quickly, preparing to unload. It wasn't just the cargo that mattered anymore. It was the people involved. Marino's men were already on the ground, and Dwayne had no intention of letting them get away with this shipment. The ship docked with a loud clank, and the men began unloading large crates with the kind of precision only experienced criminals had. Dwayne's pulse quickened as he saw what they were carrying. Nothing good. He had a feeling that tonight was going to get a lot worse before it got better. Frank's voice cut through the tension. "On my mark. Now." They moved swiftly, silently, slipping through the shadows like ghosts. Dwayne could feel his heart hammering in his chest, the thrill of the chase taking over as they closed in on the shipment. He could already see the crates stacked high, ready to be loaded onto another truck. It wasn't just the drugs they were worried about. No, this was bigger. Smuggling, corruption, and enough firepower to level a city block. As they neared, a sudden flash of movement caught Dwayne's eye. He froze, his hand going instinctively to the gun tucked at his side. Marino's men had spotted them. Before he could react, the sound of gunfire echoed across the docks, the sharp crack of bullets cutting through the night air. Dwayne dove behind a stack of crates, pulling Frank with him as the men started shooting. The battle had begun. The air was thick with the sound of gunfire, echoing off the metal beams of the warehouse and the cargo crates stacked high like silent witnesses. Dwayne crouched low, his back pressed against the cold steel of a large shipping container, feeling the heat of the bullets that narrowly missed. Frank was beside him, his face set in a grim expression as he checked his weapon. The tension in the air was palpable. The mission had gone from a covert operation to an all-out firefight in an instant. "Stay down," Frank hissed as another round of shots whizzed by, embedding themselves into the crate behind them with a sharp, metallic thud. Dwayne's mind raced. They had to act fast. The more time they spent hiding, the more Marino's men would tighten their grip on the docks. Every minute was a countdown to disaster. He peeked over the top of the crate, just enough to see a few of Marino's henchmen moving toward their position. Their dark uniforms blended with the shadows, but their glinting weapons made them easy targets. "Frank," Dwayne muttered, his voice low but urgent, "we need a plan. If we stay here, we're just sitting ducks." Frank scanned the area, his mind calculating. The sound of the boat engines had faded, but there was still enough activity around the docks to keep them on edge. He looked at Dwayne, his eyes narrowing. We need to take out the guards first. Then we can get to the shipment. We'll move in pairs, cover each other's backs. You take the right side. I'll go left. Dwayne nodded, his pulse racing. Every part of him screamed to stay focused, to make every move count. One mistake now could mean the end of the line for both of them. They didn't have a choice. They couldn't back down now. On my count, Frank whispered, his eyes scanning the movement ahead. 3, 2, go. In an instant, Dwayne pushed off the crate, moving swiftly and silently toward the right. He slid behind another stack of crates, barely making a sound, and took a quick breath. There were 2 of Marino's men standing in the open, too close to the crates to be able to see him coming. They were focused on the front of the warehouse, unaware of his approach. Dwayne exhaled slowly, his training kicking in. He was fast, too fast for them to react. In one fluid motion, he lunged forward, grabbing the nearest guard by the shoulder and twisting him into a chokehold. The man struggled, but Dwayne tightened his grip until the man's movements slowed and then stopped completely. He dropped him to the ground silently, his body now a dead weight in the shadows. The second man turned just in time to see the lifeless body of his colleague hit the floor, but Dwayne was already on him. He slammed his fist into the man's face, sending him stumbling backward into a stack of crates. The guard's weapon fell to the ground, and Dwayne took advantage of the moment, kicking the gun out of reach before knocking the man unconscious with a precise strike to the jaw. The silence that followed was thick, the only sound the quick, heavy breaths Dwayne took as he wiped the sweat from his brow. 2 guards down. But that wasn't enough. There were more out there, and time was running out. Frank was already moving toward the other side, taking out another 2 men with the same ruthless efficiency. Move up. Frank's voice called out from across the warehouse. We've got no time to waste. Dwayne followed Frank's command, his eyes darting around, scanning for more threats. They were getting closer to the shipment now. He could see the crates, the large stack of cargo piled near the far end of the warehouse, and he knew that Marino's men wouldn't let them get any closer without a fight. But as they moved in, something felt off. The hairs on the back of Dwayne's neck stood up, and his instincts screamed at him. The lights above flickered, casting long, eerie shadows across the concrete floor. Dwayne held up a hand, signaling Frank to stop. Something's wrong, Dwayne whispered, his voice tense. This feels like a setup. Frank's eyes darted around, his jaw tight. No time to second-guess. Stay sharp. But just as Frank spoke, the sound of a door slamming open echoed across the warehouse, followed by the unmistakable sound of boots hitting the ground, dozens of them. Dwayne's heart dropped into his stomach as he turned to see a new wave of armed men flooding into the warehouse. They were wearing tactical gear, more organized than the previous guards. Marino had anticipated them. Ambush, Frank muttered under his breath. Before Dwayne could react, the sound of heavy machine guns ripped through the air, the sharp cracks of gunfire so deafening that his ears rang. He threw himself to the ground, rolling behind cover as the bullets tore through the crates and the walls around them. Frank fired back, his shots quick and controlled, but it was clear. Marino's men had them surrounded. They were trapped. Dwayne's mind raced as he thought of their options. The shipment was still within reach, but the risks were growing exponentially. There was no way they could fight their way out of this without backup. They needed to find an escape route, and fast. Stay down, Frank barked, his voice a command. We need to break out of here. Dwayne nodded, his pulse quickening. They couldn't get to the shipment now. Their only chance was to fight their way out of the warehouse and regroup. But getting to the exit meant navigating through a storm of bullets. They moved cautiously, Dwayne keeping his body low as he crouched behind a series of crates. He could hear the sound of footsteps getting closer. Marino's men were sweeping the area, closing in on their position. Time was running out. There's an exit to the back, Frank said, his voice barely audible over the noise. We can make it, but we need to push through. Ready? Dwayne took a breath. His body was already bruised and battered, but the fire inside him burned brighter than ever. They couldn't let this be the end. "Let's go," Dwayne said, his voice steady, his resolve unshaken. They broke cover, moving in a zigzag pattern as bullets ricocheted around them. The sound of gunfire was deafening, but Dwayne kept his focus. Frank led the way, firing back at Marino's men, creating a small path for them to move forward. Every step was a gamble, but it was the only one they had left. They reached the back of the warehouse, where the exit was hidden behind a large stack of crates. Frank pushed the door open just as the sound of more footsteps filled the air. They were close. Too close. "Go!" Frank shouted. Dwayne followed him, his heart racing. The world seemed to blur as they sprinted out of the warehouse, their footsteps pounding against the pavement, their breath coming in ragged gasps. They were out, but this fight was far from over. The cold night air felt like a slap to the face as Dwayne and Frank emerged from the warehouse, the distant sound of gunfire still ringing in their ears. They kept running, pushing themselves harder, faster. They knew that the ambush had been only the beginning. The men chasing them wouldn't stop until they had caught up. "Keep moving," Frank yelled, his voice barely audible over the rush of their footsteps. Dwayne didn't need to be told twice. His legs burned with exhaustion, but the adrenaline pumping through his veins kept him moving. They had no time to regroup. The docks were still teeming with Marino's men, and they weren't about to let their targets slip away. As they rounded the corner of the warehouse and ducked into a narrow alley, Dwayne stole a glance over his shoulder. No sign of pursuit, yet, but they wouldn't be safe for long. He could feel the weight of the situation bearing down on him. Everything they'd worked for, the flash drive, the intel, the plan to take Marino down, was at risk of crumbling if they didn't make a move soon. "We need to get to the car," Frank panted, his eyes darting around as they came to a halt behind a stack of garbage bins. "And fast. If Marino's men are on us, there's no telling how many more are on their way." Dwayne nodded. His mind was already working, running through every possible escape route. Their car was parked a few blocks away, tucked in an alley to avoid detection. But with Marino's men flooding the area, getting to it without being spotted would be a miracle. "We take the back streets," Dwayne said, his voice low but steady. "Stay low, keep your head down, and don't look back." Frank gave a tight nod. "Let's move." They darted out of the alley, hugging the shadows as they cut through a maze of side streets. Every corner they turned felt like it could be their last. The city seemed to close in on them. The streets were eerily quiet, but there was an unmistakable sense of danger lurking just beyond every corner. Dwayne's senses were on high alert. He could hear the faint sounds of distant sirens, the hum of traffic, but nothing else seemed real. His focus was razor-sharp, his instinct screaming at him to keep moving, to keep going. After a few blocks, they reached the alley where they had parked the car. Dwayne stopped just short of the corner, peering around it to make sure the coast was clear. He couldn't risk being seen, not now. They had to make this next move count. "Think they're on us yet?" Frank whispered, his voice tense. "I don't know," Dwayne muttered, "but I'm not sticking around to find out." He motioned for Frank to follow as they slipped around the corner. The car was still there, thankfully. Dwayne approached cautiously, scanning the area one last time before sliding into the driver's seat. Frank quickly followed, jumping into the passenger seat and slamming the door shut behind him. Dwayne fired up the engine, the familiar roar of the car offering a small sense of comfort in the chaos. They were momentarily safe, but only momentarily. Dwayne's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror. He was sure Marino's men wouldn't give up so easily. "We need a plan," Dwayne said, his grip tightening on the steering wheel. "We can't go back to the apartment. Too risky. We need to lay low, figure out our next move." Frank rubbed his temples, trying to think through the haze of adrenaline. "There's a safe house on the east side of town. We've used it before. If we can get there without being followed, we can regroup and figure out what to do next." Dwayne considered the suggestion. The east side was a good option. It was isolated, hidden away in the outskirts of the city, and it was the last place anyone would think to look for them. The problem was, they needed to get there undetected, and Marino's men were likely already hunting for them. Dwayne's heart raced as he pressed the pedal to the floor. The car surged forward, the engine roaring as they tried to put distance between themselves and their pursuers. But the other vehicle was relentless. a sleek black SUV that seemed to be tailing them with terrifying precision. "Do you have anything for this?" Dwayne asked, his eyes flicking to Frank, who was already rummaging through his bag. "I've got a few tricks," Frank muttered, pulling out a small device that looked like a GPS tracker. "If they keep following us, we'll lose them for good." Dwayne glanced at the mirror again. The SUV was getting closer. They needed to act fast. "Now, Frank," Dwayne barked. Frank pressed a button on the device, and the sound of a loud beep filled the car. Seconds later, a burst of static filled the air as a signal jammer activated, disrupting the SUV's tracking systems. For a moment, Dwayne allowed himself a small breath of relief. It wouldn't last long, but it was enough to give them a head start. The SUV hesitated, clearly trying to recalibrate, but Dwayne didn't give them a chance to recover. He swerved sharply, taking an off-ramp that led them onto a winding road through a residential area. The roads were narrow here, winding through old houses with overgrown lawns, and Dwayne knew it was their best shot to lose their tail. The car jerked left and right as Dwayne navigated the twisting streets, weaving through parked cars and tight corners. Behind them, the sound of the SUV's engine roared as it tried to keep up. But then, an idea sparked in Dwayne's mind. He slammed the car into a hard left turn, heading toward an industrial area at the edge of town. The roads here were more open, less crowded, and with fewer places for their pursuers to hide. "We're almost there," Dwayne said, his voice tight. "Get ready." Frank glanced at him, his expression steely. "Let's do this." The SUV was closing in again, but Dwayne had a plan. He wasn't just running. He was preparing to turn the tables. As they reached a large intersection, Dwayne swerved sharply to the right, crashing through a narrow alley between two buildings. The SUV tried to follow, but the alley was too tight, forcing the pursuers to slow down. Dwayne accelerated, pushing the car to its limits, until he saw the large, abandoned warehouse on the left. Without hesitation, he pulled into the lot and slammed the brakes. Frank barely had time to react as Dwayne threw the car into reverse, quickly backing into a dark corner, out of sight. They were hidden, for now. Dwayne exhaled sharply, his heart pounding in his chest. They were safe for the moment, but the game had changed. Marino knew they were coming for him, and they were running out of time. Frank looked over at Dwayne, a grim smile crossing his face. "Well, that was fun." Dwayne didn't smile. Not yet. He knew the storm was far from over. "We've got one shot at this," Dwayne said, his voice low. "We can't afford to fail. The next move is everything." The quiet of the industrial lot felt surreal after the chaos they had just endured. Dwayne and Frank sat in the car, catching their breath, the faint hum of the city in the distance barely reaching their ears. The adrenaline had worn off, leaving behind an exhaustion that settled deep in their bones. But they couldn't relax, not yet. The storm was still on the horizon, and Marino wasn't the type to back down easily. Dwayne sat with his hands on the steering wheel, his eyes scanning the dark alley for any signs of movement. He could hear Frank in the passenger seat, breathing heavily, but neither of them spoke for a long moment. "We can't keep running like this," Frank finally broke the silence, his voice low. "We're cornered. They know we're onto them. Marino's not going to stop until we're out of the picture." Dwayne nodded, his jaw tight. Frank was right. The clock was ticking, and if they didn't make their move soon, they'd be out of options. But this wasn't just about surviving anymore. This was about finishing what they had started. The mission wasn't complete, not by a long shot. "Then we make sure he doesn't see us coming," Dwayne replied, his voice cold but steady. "We hit him where it hurts. We take down his operation, his people, one by one. It's the only way this ends." Frank met Dwayne's gaze, his eyes hard with determination. "You've got a plan?" "I do now," Dwayne said, his mind already working through the next steps. "We've got enough intel to track down where Marino's operations are being run. We know he's got warehouses all over the city, but there's one that stands out, a location that's been under the radar. If we can get in there, we'll find something that leads us to him." "And we don't even have a team," Frank reminded him. "It's just us." Dwayne's lips curved into a grim smile. "It's always been just us, Frank. And if we're going to take down Marino, we need to hit him hard and fast. No hesitation." No second chances. Frank exhaled, rubbing his face. All right, I'm in. But what about the safe house? What about getting the intel to the right people? Later, Dwayne said. We can't waste time. If we let him regroup, we lose the element of surprise. And right now, that's the only thing in our favor. Frank gave a small nod. He knew Dwayne was right. Time was a luxury they couldn't afford. The two men sat in the car for a few more minutes, making sure they weren't being followed, but the silence of the lot remained uninterrupted. Dwayne finally started the engine and slowly pulled out of the alley, his eyes flicking to the rearview mirror. The city was still a maze of possibilities, each turn bringing them closer to their goal, but also deeper into danger. They weren't in the clear yet, and Dwayne knew better than to think they were safe for long. The drive to the warehouse felt like an eternity. Dwayne's mind kept racing, each passing street a reminder of how far they had come and how much more was at stake. He could feel the weight of the situation pressing down on him, but it was nothing compared to the responsibility that came with the mission. As they approached the outskirts of the city, the buildings started to thin out, replaced by more industrial structures, abandoned factories, and empty lots. The warehouse Dwayne had in mind was tucked into one of these lonely corners, far from prying eyes, but close enough to Marino's main operations that it could be used as a central hub for all his dirty work. Dwayne slowed the car as they neared the area, the dim light from the street lamps casting long shadows on the pavement. He parked the car behind a low fence, well out of view of the main road, and the two men quickly slipped out, making their way toward the warehouse on foot. Remember, stay low and move quickly, Dwayne whispered to Frank as they neared the warehouse. We can't afford any mistakes. Frank nodded, checking his weapon one last time. Got it. I'll take the left side. You go right. They split up, moving in synchronicity, their steps silent against the cracked pavement. The warehouse loomed ahead, dark and imposing, the silhouette of the building barely visible in the moonlight. Dwayne's pulse quickened, but he didn't slow his pace. They had come too far to turn back now. As they neared the side entrance of the warehouse, Dwayne signaled to Frank. The door was locked, but it wasn't an issue for Dwayne. He pulled out a small set of tools, working quickly and efficiently to unlock the door without making a sound. After a few moments, there was a soft click, and the door swung open. Dwayne motioned for Frank to follow him, and they slipped inside. The interior of the warehouse was dark, the only light coming from the dim glow of a few scattered emergency lights. The air was thick with dust, and the faint smell of oil and metal hung in the air. Dwayne's eyes adjusted quickly to the low light as he moved deeper into the warehouse, staying close to the walls and using the large crates and machinery for cover. They moved cautiously, scanning the area for any signs of movement. The warehouse was massive, far bigger than Dwayne had expected, but it was also eerily quiet. Too quiet. It felt like the calm before the storm. Stay sharp, Dwayne muttered, his eyes scanning every corner, every shadow. Something's off. Frank nodded, his hand gripping his gun tighter. They continued to move through the maze of crates and machinery, their footsteps muffled by the sound of their own breathing. Dwayne's senses were on high alert. He was waiting for the other shoe to drop, the moment when everything went wrong. They reached the central area of the warehouse, and that's when Dwayne saw it. A large, reinforced door at the far end, guarded by two men. The door was a heavy steel, its edges worn and scratched, as if it had been opened and closed countless times. This was it, the heart of Marino's operation. That's our target, Dwayne said, his voice barely above a whisper. Frank glanced at him, a questioning look in his eyes. You think we can take them out without getting spotted? Dwayne didn't answer immediately. Instead, he surveyed the guards, noting their positions and the way they were communicating. One of them was looking down at his phone, distracted. The other was standing by the door, scanning the area. We take out the distracted one first, Dwayne said, his voice steady. I'll handle the one at the door. Frank nodded. On three? Dwayne's lips twitched into a small smile. On three. They moved into position, their steps synchronized as they crept closer. The first guard was just a few feet away, still oblivious to their presence. Dwayne's pulse quickened, but his focus was absolute. This was it, the moment they had been building toward. 1, 2, 3. With lightning speed, Dwayne lunged at the first guard, slamming him against the wall and rendering him unconscious with a swift strike. Frank moved in on the second guard, disarming him and knocking him out in one smooth motion. The door was theirs. Dwayne exhaled, his heart still racing. Let's finish this. They approached the door cautiously, ready for whatever lay beyond. The silence inside the warehouse was oppressive. Dwayne and Frank stood at the reinforced door, their breaths shallow, their hearts beating loudly in their chests. They could feel the weight of the moment pressing on them. The next few minutes could determine everything. Dwayne motioned for Frank to cover him as he slowly inched the door open. The hinges creaked, but it wasn't loud enough to alert anyone inside. Beyond the door lay a narrow hallway, dimly lit by a few flickering lights. The air was thick with the scent of old machinery and stale metal, and the only sound was the soft scuff of their boots against the concrete floor. Dwayne kept his gun drawn, his senses on high alert. The place felt like a labyrinth, endless rows of boxes, crates, and stacks of machinery, all carefully arranged like a fortress. They moved quickly but cautiously, following the hallway to a set of stairs that led up to a catwalk overlooking the main floor. From their vantage point, they could see the center of the warehouse. A large table surrounded by chairs, each chair occupied by a shadowy figure. In the dim light, Dwayne could just make out the shape of a familiar face, Marino. "He's here," Dwayne whispered, barely containing his excitement. "This is it. He's not going to get away this time." Frank nodded, his eyes scanning the room. "You sure we can take him down now?" Dwayne didn't answer right away. He was too focused on Marino and the men surrounding him. His mind raced through the options. A direct confrontation could end in a firefight, but if they were careful, they could get close enough to catch Marino off guard. The problem was the men in the room with him. Marino was no fool. He wouldn't be sitting there unprotected. "We're not just going after Marino," Dwayne said, his voice cold. "We need to take out the whole operation. He's got more muscle than we can handle, and we've got no backup. So we do this smart." Frank's eyes locked with Dwayne's, understanding the gravity of the situation. "All right, what's the plan?" Dwayne took a deep breath, his mind working through the scenario. "We'll get to the lower level, find a way to knock out the power, and then isolate Marino. We take out his crew one by one. But we do it quietly." "Quietly? In here?" Frank raised an eyebrow. "You're dreaming if you think that's possible." Dwayne grinned. "It's not about what's possible. It's about making it happen." The two men moved swiftly, taking a set of stairs down to the main floor, avoiding any direct confrontation as they passed through the shadows. They could hear snippets of conversation from the men around the table, voices low and intense, speaking in hushed tones. Dwayne's heart pounded as he tried to pick out the words, but the distance was too great to make sense of them. When they reached the base of the stairs, Dwayne signaled for Frank to stay put. He crept forward, using the cover of an old crate to shield himself from view, and peered around the corner into the main area. His eyes scanned the room, and his heart sank. Marino's men weren't just seated around the table. They were armed to the teeth. There were at least 6 of them, all wearing tactical gear, clearly prepared for something big. Marino, seated at the head of the table, didn't look like he was ready to leave anytime soon. He was leaning over a set of blueprints, his finger tracing a route. But it wasn't just the men that worried Dwayne. It was the guards stationed at the perimeter, watching every exit, every entrance. They were not taking any chances. "We need to move," Dwayne muttered to Frank, turning back to him. "There's no way we can take them all out at once. But there's a way to get to Marino." Frank's eyes flicked over to the far corner, where a series of electrical panels lined the wall. "The power?" "Exactly," Dwayne said. "We cut the lights, disable their security systems. It'll give us the chance to grab Marino and get out." Frank nodded, his face serious. "But if we trip an alarm, we'll have the whole building on us. You ready for that?" Dwayne didn't flinch. "I was born ready." They crept toward the electrical panel, moving as silently as possible. As they reached the corner, Dwayne took a quick glance around, checking for guards. The men in the center were still distracted, talking amongst themselves, and the guards by the exits hadn't moved. Dwayne slid into position, pulling a small device from his belt. It was a simple but effective tool, a signal jammer that would temporarily disable the electrical systems. He hooked it into the wiring panel and flipped the switch. A soft hum filled the air, followed by a flicker of the lights. And then, everything went dark. For a few seconds, the entire warehouse was plunged into complete blackness. Dwayne could feel the adrenaline surge through his veins as the silence stretched on. Then, a soft beeping sound echoed through the room, signaling the failure of the security system. Voices broke out in confusion. Panic set in. "Where's the power? What the hell is going on?" one of Marino's men shouted. Dwayne didn't wait for another second. He motioned for Frank to follow, and they bolted toward the center of the room, keeping low, using the shadows to their advantage. Marino's men scrambled to figure out what was happening, their attention fixed on the power outage. As Dwayne and Frank closed the distance to the table, they both readied their weapons. They were so close now, just a few steps away from Marino. The tension was unbearable, the weight of the moment pressing down on them like a vice. Dwayne's eyes locked onto Marino, who was rising from his seat, his eyes scanning the darkness. "Move!" Dwayne barked to Frank. In one fluid motion, Dwayne and Frank charged forward, guns drawn. The first guard near Marino reacted too slowly, and Frank took him out with a single shot, the body crumpling to the floor. Marino's eyes widened as he turned toward them, but it was too late. Dwayne grabbed him by the arm and yanked him toward the door, keeping his gun pressed against Marino's back. "You're coming with us," Dwayne growled. The dark silence of the warehouse seemed to swallow them whole as Dwayne and Frank pulled Marino through the dim corridors, his movements sluggish but compliant. The entire operation was in chaos now. Panic had set in among Marino's crew. The lights were out, the security systems were down, and the sound of scrambling boots echoed through the warehouse. Every step Dwayne took was calculated, his hand firmly gripping Marino's collar. There was no room for error now. They couldn't afford to be sloppy. They had Marino, but that was only the beginning. "Keep moving," Dwayne muttered to Frank, his eyes scanning every shadow as they maneuvered toward the back exit. The last thing they needed was to get caught with their backs turned. Frank stayed close, his gun still drawn, his face set in grim determination. "We're almost there. We need to make it to the car. Fast." Dwayne nodded, his mind working at lightning speed. The plan had always been to extract Marino, but now there was a new problem: getting out alive. Marino's crew would be hunting them down, and they were outnumbered. Dwayne could hear the shouts getting louder behind them. They were closing in. "I don't know how much longer we have before they're on our tail," Frank said, glancing over his shoulder. "We can't keep this pace up." Dwayne's mind raced. They needed a distraction, something to buy them time, and fast. He glanced toward the main area of the warehouse, where the most critical part of Marino's operation was located, the supply depot. A plan began to form. "Frank, we need to get to the supply room. It's a risk, but if we cause a little chaos back there, we can slow them down long enough to get Marino to the car." Frank's brow furrowed. "You want to blow something up in here? With Marino still with us?" "We don't have much of a choice," Dwayne replied. "They're already looking for us. The more we delay them, the better our chances of escaping." Frank didn't hesitate. "Lead the way." They pivoted sharply, heading in the direction of the supply room. As they moved deeper into the maze of crates and storage units, the tension was almost unbearable. Every footstep, every breath, felt like it could be their last. The supply room was just ahead, a steel door with a keypad lock. Dwayne's mind worked quickly, recalling the blueprint of the warehouse he'd memorized earlier. They had two options: break in or make noise. He wasn't about to waste time trying to crack a code. With a single motion, Dwayne pulled out a small set of explosives, a tool he always kept for moments like this. He'd planted them on the corner of the door, right by the hinges. Frank kept watch, his eyes darting between Dwayne and the distant noise of approaching footsteps. "Ready?" Dwayne asked, his voice low but firm. Frank gave him a quick nod. "Do it." Dwayne's finger pressed a button on the detonator. There was a flash of light and a deafening bang as the explosion rocked the building, sending a cloud of dust and debris into the air. The force of the blast caused several nearby crates to topple over, blocking the hallways and making a mess of everything in their path. What the hell was that? Marino shouted from behind them, panic in his voice. That's our cue, Dwayne growled. With the way now clear, they dragged Marino toward the supply room, ducking into the chaos. The explosion had done its job. His men were distracted, and it would take them precious seconds to regroup and come after them. But they couldn't let up now. They had to move faster. Inside the supply room, Dwayne shoved Marino against a wall, his eyes cold. You're not going anywhere, not until we get the answers we need. Marino sneered, but the fear was evident in his eyes. You think you've won? You think you can just waltz in and take me down? You don't know what you're dealing with, Johnson. Dwayne leaned in, his voice dangerously low. You're going to tell me everything, Marino. And if you don't, I'll make sure your people pay for every life you've destroyed. Marino's expression flickered for a moment. Was it fear or defiance? Either way, it didn't matter. Dwayne had no intention of letting him walk away from this. As Frank secured the door to the supply room, Dwayne kept his focus on Marino, knowing they were running out of time. They needed information, and fast. Marino chuckled darkly, his voice dripping with venom. You think I'm afraid of you? You don't know the men I'm working with, Johnson. They're coming for you. Dwayne's patience wore thin. He moved closer, his tone deadly. Who? Marino's lips curled into a twisted grin. You'll find out soon enough. You're already too deep into this. It's already too late. Just as Dwayne's temper began to flare, Frank motioned to the back of the room. We've got movement. Someone's coming. Dwayne didn't hesitate. We're not done yet, Marino. Keep talking. Before Marino could respond, the sound of footsteps grew louder, and Dwayne knew they had moments, maybe seconds, before they were discovered. He glanced at Frank, who nodded. Time to go. All right, Marino, Dwayne said, his voice cold as steel. You're coming with us, whether you like it or not. And if you try anything, I'll make sure it's the last mistake you ever make. With that, they shoved Marino forward, heading for the back exit. But as they rounded the corner, they collided with an unexpected force. Another one of Marino's men, heavily armed, his eyes full of fury. Without thinking, Frank fired first, the bullet hitting the man square in the chest. He dropped like a stone, and Dwayne pushed forward, dragging Marino along with them. Move, Dwayne yelled. They reached the back door just as the sound of more footsteps echoed behind them. The chase was on again, but this time, they weren't stopping until they were clear. The night air hit them like a slap to the face as Dwayne and Frank bolted out of the warehouse, dragging Marino between them. The chaos inside the building was escalating. Gunshots echoed through the warehouse, and the sound of heavy footsteps grew louder by the second. They could hear their enemies closing in, but they didn't stop. Marino struggled in Dwayne's grip, trying to wriggle free, but Dwayne's hold was like iron. Every step felt like it could be their last, and with each passing moment, the situation seemed to become more desperate. But they couldn't afford to look back now. Their only focus was the car, and the slim chance of making it out alive. Keep your head down. Dwayne barked at Marino. His voice was full of authority, but the tension in his body betrayed his own anxiety. Frank was ahead, already scanning the alleyway leading to the car. We're almost there. Just keep moving. They pushed forward, the sounds of their pursuers growing louder. Dwayne glanced over his shoulder to see several of Marino's men spilling out of the warehouse, guns raised. The first bullet whizzed past them, narrowly missing Dwayne's head. Damn it! Frank cursed under his breath, ducking as more shots rang out. Dwayne pulled Marino closer, his grip tightening. They were running out of time. We need to make it to the alley, Dwayne shouted. Now! They sprinted the last few meters to the car, Frank already halfway inside, his eyes wide with urgency. Dwayne shoved Marino into the back seat and jumped in beside him, slamming the door shut just as another round of gunfire shattered the night. The engine roared to life, and Frank slammed the car into drive. The car screeched as Frank gunned it down the street, fishtailing around corners to avoid the hail of bullets. Dwayne's pulse was still racing, but he couldn't allow himself to relax yet. They had Marino, but the night was far from over. Hold on, Dwayne said, his voice gruff. We're not safe yet. Frank glanced over at him. How do we get out of this mess? They won't stop coming after us. I know, Dwayne muttered, but we need to get some distance first. After that, we'll figure it out. They hit the highway, the city lights behind them flickering like a fading memory. But even as they gained speed, the tension in the car was suffocating. Marino was sitting silently in the back seat, glaring at them with cold hatred, but Dwayne wasn't about to let his guard down. So, Marino, Dwayne said, keeping his voice calm but firm, you want to talk now? We've got plenty of time. Marino let out a harsh laugh, his eyes dark and full of venom. You think I'm going to tell you anything? You've got no idea who you're dealing with. Dwayne turned to look at him, his eyes unwavering. I know exactly who you are. You're a man who thinks he's invincible, a man who hides behind his men and his power. But now, you're alone. And you're going to tell me everything I need to know, or I'll make sure you regret it. Marino's expression shifted slightly, but it was hard to tell if it was fear or just pure defiance. He didn't speak for a long moment. Then, he leaned back in his seat and sighed, as if calculating his next move. You're not going to stop what's coming, Marino said slowly. There's no stopping it now. You've already made it worse. Dwayne's grip on the seat tightened. What are you talking about? You think it's just me? I'm just the middleman, Marino scoffed. The real power is much bigger than you can imagine. You're playing right into their hands. Dwayne's heart skipped a beat. Who's behind all of this? Marino's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, as if searching for something or someone. Then he leaned forward, lowering his voice. There's no one person you can blame. This goes all the way to the top. But you're not going to get the answers from me. You've already made enemies of the wrong people. You won't be able to hide from them. Dwayne's mind raced. Who, Marino? You don't get to play games now. The car jolted slightly as Frank swerved to avoid an incoming vehicle. It was too close for comfort. The sound of a distant siren echoed in the night. They were being hunted. But this time, they weren't alone. Dwayne shot a glance at Frank. What's going on? Are we being followed? Frank's eyes were glued to the rearview mirror, his expression grim. Yeah, we've got at least 2 cars on us. They're gaining. Dwayne cursed under his breath. We're not getting out of this without a fight. Frank's knuckles turned white on the steering wheel. You think Marino's the only one who can put up a fight? You haven't seen what's in the back seat of this car. Dwayne turned to face Frank, confused. What are you talking about? Before Frank could answer, the back seat door swung open, and a man jumped inside, a hulking figure whose sudden appearance took Dwayne by surprise. He wasn't dressed like the usual tough guy. He wore a sleek black suit and had a calm, calculating expression on his face. All right, Dwayne, that's enough running, the man said, his voice steady, almost friendly. Dwayne tensed, hand reaching for his gun. Who the hell are you? The man didn't flinch. Name's Oliver, and I think we can help each other out. Dwayne's mind was spinning. This was the last thing he expected. Help each other out? You're with Marino? Oliver gave a sharp nod. Not quite, but you're up against something bigger than just Marino, and I have the resources you need to make it through. Frank slammed on the brakes, sending the car into a wild skid. Dwayne's head jerked forward, but he didn't take his eyes off Oliver. Listen, Oliver said, his tone now more urgent. We don't have much time. You've been running from the wrong people, and unless you want everyone you know dead, you need to trust me. The words hung in the air. Dwayne was caught between disbelief and the cold, hard reality that they had no way out unless they played their cards right. Who are we up against? Dwayne asked, his voice low. Oliver's face darkened. The kind of people who don't lose. But if you want to live, if you want to take Marino down, you'll need an ally like me. Dwayne wasn't sure what to think, but the situation was too dangerous to ignore. They had no choice but to listen. All right, Dwayne said, turning to Frank. You trust him? Frank's gaze met Dwayne's, and for a moment, everything seemed to freeze. Then, Frank gave a reluctant nod. Let's hear him out. Oliver smiled. Good choice. The car skidded to a halt at the edge of a darkened alley, the tires screeching against the asphalt. Dwayne could feel the weight of the night pressing down on him, the tension in the air palpable as Oliver sat silently beside him, his expression unreadable. We're here, Frank muttered, glancing over his shoulder nervously. Do we trust him? Dwayne didn't answer immediately. His thoughts were spinning. He hadn't expected an ally to just drop into their laps, especially not one with the kind of calm confidence that Oliver exuded. But right now, it wasn't about trust. It was about survival. Let's see what he has to say, Dwayne said, his voice low and steady. His hand never left the door handle. They were always one step away from a fight, and he knew it. Oliver shifted in the back seat, his eyes sharp. We don't have much time, he said. If you're serious about taking Marino down, we need to act fast. Dwayne turned his head slowly to look at him. You've been awfully quiet about who you are. Care to fill us in? Oliver's lips curved into a tight smile. I'm not the one you should be asking about, Dwayne. You should be asking about the people chasing you. Yeah, we know about them, Frank chimed in, his hand tightening around the steering wheel. But how does he fit into this? Oliver leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. It's not about who I am. It's about who I can get you to. You're up against a network. You'll never take Marino down on your own, but with the right connections, we can do it. And not just Marino. There's a much bigger game being played here. Dwayne's eyes narrowed. What are you talking about? Who's behind this? Oliver paused, the weight of the moment hanging between them. The people after Marino and now you, they're a part of a much larger operation. A powerful syndicate, with resources that make Marino's crew look like amateurs. And they've got plans that go far beyond what you can imagine. Frank's eyes flicked to Dwayne. What are we getting ourselves into? We need to know everything, Dwayne answered, staring intently at Oliver. Because if we're going to do this, it has to be all or nothing. Oliver nodded, understanding the weight of Dwayne's words. Exactly. But you've got to be prepared for what's coming. What I can give you isn't easy, and it isn't safe. This isn't about the police. It's about power, real power, and getting out of this alive. Dwayne leaned back, exhaling slowly. He wasn't sure if Oliver was the right ally or just another player in this tangled mess. But one thing was certain. They didn't have many options left. All right, Dwayne said, his voice hardening. We'll listen. But we're not trusting anyone blindly. Fair enough, Oliver replied, his tone still calm but now tinged with a hint of urgency. Here's what you need to know. He reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and pulled out a folder, sliding it across the seat to Dwayne. The folder was heavy, the kind that contained documents meant for people who weren't supposed to know too much. Dwayne's fingers trembled slightly as he opened it. Inside were pictures, documents, and blueprints. Everything that didn't make sense at first glance, but everything that added up when he started connecting the dots. This is a map of Marino's operation, Oliver said. It's big, way bigger than just him. But it's not just him you're after. Dwayne studied the contents of the folder. Maps of warehouses, names of key players, locations that he knew were more than just street addresses. They were the heart of a vast, underground empire. This wasn't just a mob or a crime syndicate. It was something far deeper, far more dangerous. Who's pulling the strings? Frank asked, his voice tight. That's the million-dollar question, Oliver said, leaning back in his seat. You've already tangled with Marino, but the real question is, who's behind him? The person you need to focus on is Drake Sterling. The name hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. He'd heard whispers of Sterling before. Another name that circulated through the underworld. A name that commanded power without ever revealing his face. Sterling? Dwayne repeated. That name doesn't come up for nothing. Who the hell is he? Oliver gave a sharp, humorless smile. Drake Sterling is the man who controls everything you've been fighting. He's the reason Marino and all the others are in play. You've been chasing shadows, Dwayne. He's the man pulling the strings. Dwayne's mind raced as he tried to process the information. So Marino's just a pawn? Exactly, Oliver said, but a dangerous pawn. Marino's got enough power to do damage, but Sterling? He's the one who moves the pieces. You think taking Marino down will end this? It won't. You need to take down Sterling to end this. Frank cursed under his breath. You're telling us we've been playing the wrong game this whole time? That's what I've been trying to tell you, Oliver replied. You're dealing with a monster, but I can help you bring him down. You can't do it alone. Dwayne's mind was racing now, every piece of the puzzle clicking together. This wasn't just about stopping a crime syndicate, it was about taking down an empire. But he didn't have all the pieces. Not yet. We need more than just intel, Dwayne said, his tone hard. We need a plan. And we need the muscle to back it up. You got that? Oliver's eyes gleamed with a knowing look. I've got more than that. I've got people who owe me. People who can help. But you need to make the decision now. We go after Sterling, or you walk away from all of this. But I'll tell you this. Walking away isn't an option. Dwayne looked at Frank, who gave him a silent nod. There was no going back. We're in, Dwayne said, his voice grim but determined. But I'm not doing this half-assed. If we're going after Sterling, we do it right. We take down the whole damn operation. Oliver smiled. That's the spirit. The night seemed to stretch on forever as Dwayne, Frank, and Oliver huddled in the dimly lit room, the weight of their decision hanging heavily in the air. The folder on the table between them was like a ticking bomb, its contents offering both the promise of answers and the danger of uncovering things better left unknown. All right, Dwayne said, breaking the silence. His voice was rough, but resolute. We go after Sterling, but we need to know exactly what we're up against. I need a plan, Oliver. Not just half-formed ideas. This needs to be precise. Oliver leaned back in his chair, fingers steepled together, as though considering the request. His eyes never left Dwayne, cold but calculating. You think this is going to be easy? He asked softly. You think there's a perfect plan that guarantees success? No, Dwayne replied, his jaw tightening. I just need to know what we're stepping into. What Sterling has that we don't? Oliver let out a breath, as if he'd been expecting this question. Sterling's operation is unlike anything you've seen. He's got money, muscle, and influence everywhere. He's got people in high places, people who make the rules, and others who enforce them. He's not just a criminal mastermind. He's a kingpin, a puppet master with strings in every major city. Frank shifted in his seat. So what? We're supposed to just march in there and take him down? That's the goal, Oliver said, his voice steady, but there was an edge to it. But it's not that simple. Sterling doesn't operate like Marino. He's not sloppy or reckless. He's cold, methodical. He's got a network of operatives who report to him, people embedded deep in government, law enforcement, even corporate sectors. He's untouchable. Dwayne's mind raced. Everything he had known, everything he had been fighting for, suddenly seemed insignificant compared to what Oliver was describing. A man who controlled more than just crime. He controlled power itself. So, what's our angle? Dwayne asked, trying to piece it together. How do we even get close to him? Oliver's eyes glinted with a spark of something. Maybe strategy, maybe something more dangerous. I've got a contact inside his operation. Someone who's been waiting for the right time to make a move. This person can get us to Sterling, but it's going to take time, trust, and the right approach. We can't just rush in and hope for the best. We need to break through his defenses, create the right opening. Frank snorted in disbelief. Trust? Time? You're talking about dealing with the devil himself. And you want us to trust the people who work for him? I know it's not ideal, Oliver said, a hint of frustration creeping into his voice. But we don't have the luxury of playing it safe. If we're going to do this, we need to be ready for everything. And I mean everything. Dwayne leaned forward, locking eyes with Oliver. So what's the plan? Oliver placed a hand on the table, the sound of his fingers tapping against the surface almost rhythmic. The first thing we need to do is destabilize Sterling's organization. Cut the head off the snake, so to speak. We need to hit him where it hurts. His money, his influence. We'll start by hitting his supply chain, and from there, we move on his key lieutenants. Frank raised an eyebrow. You're telling me we're going to start a war with a man who controls everything in the shadows? You sure about this? I'm sure, Oliver replied without hesitation. Sterling's empire isn't invincible. People like him get comfortable, they get careless. And once we hit the right targets, we'll have Sterling's attention. Dwayne's mind was spinning, but there was something about Oliver's calm demeanor that made it hard to argue. He was confident in a way that felt unsettling, like he knew exactly how this was going to play out. But Dwayne wasn't in the business of taking unnecessary risks. All right, Dwayne said. Standing up, we go after the supply chain first. But we don't go in blind. We take out the smaller players first, those who won't be missed by Sterling. We gather intel, get information, then we hit the next level. We take them one step at a time. Frank smirked. I like it. One step at a time. Oliver gave a subtle nod. That's the right approach. But we need to be careful. There are eyes everywhere. Dwayne turned to Frank. Get the team ready. We're going to need backup on this. We can't do it alone. Frank nodded. Got it. Before they could discuss further, a sudden sound interrupted them. A knock at the door. It was low at first, almost cautious, but it was enough to make everyone tense. Dwayne's hand automatically went to his holster. Oliver stood up slowly, his expression unreadable. Stay calm, he said, his voice low. I'll handle this. He walked toward the door, but before he could open it, the door creaked slightly, and a woman's voice came from the other side. It's me, Oliver. Open up. Dwayne tensed even more. Who the hell was that? Oliver's face softened just a little. It's safe. Relax. He opened the door just a crack, and a woman slipped inside. She was tall, with dark, sharp features and an air of confidence that matched Oliver's. Her clothes were sleek and professional, but there was something dangerous about the way she moved. She wasn't someone you wanted to mess with. Dwayne's eyes immediately narrowed, studying her every move. Who are you? Oliver gave a slight grin. This is Isabel. She's one of my people. She's the one who's been working on the inside. The contact I told you about. Isabel's eyes met Dwayne's, assessing him in a way that felt almost clinical. You're the muscle, she asked, her tone more curious than anything. I'm the one who gets things done, Dwayne replied, his voice steady. And you're the one who's been feeding us intel, right? Isabel's lips twitched into a small smile. I've been doing more than that. I'm here to make sure this works. Sterling's operation isn't something you can dismantle without help. Dwayne studied her for a moment, sizing her up. You trust her? He asked, turning to Oliver. Oliver's eyes never left Isabel. With my life. Dwayne exhaled slowly. All right, but I don't need anyone getting in my way. Isabel's smile faded, and for a moment, she looked almost serious. We're all on the same side here, Dwayne. We want Sterling gone as much as you do. But if you're going to take him down, you have to learn to trust the people who are helping you. Dwayne met her gaze, then looked back at Oliver. This was it. They were moving forward, no turning back now. Let's get to work, Dwayne said, his voice grim but resolute. Dwayne leaned back against the wall of the dimly lit warehouse, the chill in the air biting through his jacket. His mind was sharp, but the weight of the task at hand was like a constant drumbeat in his chest. Every move they made was critical now. Every decision, every person they trusted, could be the difference between success and failure. Isabel had laid out their first target, a series of warehouses strategically placed across the city. These weren't just any warehouses. They were the supply hubs for Sterling's operation. Weapons, drugs, counterfeit money, everything that fueled the syndicate's vast network. If they could disrupt the supply chain, it would send a clear message to Sterling that they were coming for him. Frank was already moving, checking his gear and making sure everything was in order. He was the first one to get impatient, always eager for action. But Dwayne? Dwayne had learned to think first, act second. That's how he'd survived all these years. You good? Frank asked, glancing over at Dwayne as he tightened his holster. Dwayne didn't answer immediately, his gaze fixed on the darkened horizon outside the warehouse. I've been better, he said, his voice low. But right now, we need to focus. If we do this right, it'll get Sterling's attention. If we screw up, well, we won't have the luxury of mistakes. Frank gave a brief nod, as if acknowledging the truth in Dwayne's words. I get it. Just don't let Oliver's plan go to your head. We do things our way. Got it? Dwayne met Frank's eyes. They'd been through hell together, and Dwayne trusted him more than anyone. But this wasn't the time for egos or pride. They had a job to do. I hear you. Just stay sharp, Dwayne replied. We hit them hard, hit them fast, and get the hell out. We don't need to fight every single person in there. We need information, not bodies. Oliver and Isabel had already moved to a nearby truck, preparing to meet up with their contact inside Sterling's operation. Dwayne wasn't sure how much he trusted Isabel yet, but Oliver seemed to believe in her, and that was enough, for now. Ready? Oliver called from the truck, his voice steady, calm. But Dwayne could see the tension in his eyes. He had his own stake in this, but it wasn't clear yet just how much he was willing to risk for it. Dwayne nodded, gesturing for Frank to follow. Let's get this done. They moved quickly through the shadows, their footsteps light and calculated. As they neared the first warehouse, the sound of distant engines hummed in the air. Sterling's men were always one step ahead. Dwayne's instincts screamed at him to be careful. They couldn't afford to underestimate what they were walking into. They crouched low, making their way toward a small, side entrance. The usual guard shifts had been disrupted, most likely a result of their contact tipping off Oliver about the operation. That's the only reason they had a shot at this. Frank shot Dwayne a look, and Dwayne held up a hand, signaling for him to wait. He peered around the corner, scanning the area. There was no sign of movement, yet. Dwayne's heart rate kicked up as he pulled a small device from his pocket, pressing it against the door to disable the alarm system. The seconds felt like hours. The last thing they needed was an unexpected alert. Finally, the click of the door unlocking was a welcome sound. They were in. The inside of the warehouse was eerily quiet, the air thick with the scent of metal and dust. Dwayne motioned for Frank to stay close as they crept deeper into the shadows. The main room stretched before them, a cavernous space lined with stacks of crates and boxes, a maze of goods ready to be shipped out. But the real action was deeper inside, past the main hall. As they moved, Dwayne couldn't help but notice how silent everything felt. No guards in sight. It wasn't right. He could sense the danger lurking, even if it wasn't immediately visible. Suddenly, a faint click echoed in the distance. Dwayne's instincts went into overdrive. "Down," he whispered to Frank, pushing him low against the crates. The sound of footsteps grew louder, and Dwayne's mind raced. This wasn't a routine run. They were walking into a trap. Dwayne's fingers tightened around the handle of his gun, his pulse quickening. He signaled to Frank to stay put and moved silently through the maze of crates. He needed to know who was in charge here. They couldn't afford to take out every henchman. They needed the higher-ups, the ones who could give them Sterling's weak points. They rounded a corner, and Dwayne spotted two men standing by a locked office door at the far end. They were armed, their eyes scanning the perimeter. Dwayne recognized one of them, Gabe. Dwayne motioned for Frank to flank him. They approached the pair silently, using the shadows to mask their movements. Dwayne was close enough now. He could hear their low conversation. "Don't know why Sterling wants us to sit on this shipment. Doesn't make sense," one of them was saying. "It's just a regular run, isn't it?" Gabe shook his head. "Doesn't matter what makes sense. It's not our job to ask why. We do what we're told." Dwayne couldn't wait any longer. With a swift movement, he stepped out of the shadows and pressed his gun against Gabe's back. "Don't move," Dwayne growled. The two men froze, and for a moment, it was dead silent. "You're making a mistake, man," Gabe said, his voice tight with fear. "You don't know who you're messing with." "I know exactly who I'm messing with," Dwayne replied coldly. "Now, where's Sterling? Where is he hiding?" The second man glanced nervously between Gabe and Dwayne. He didn't seem like a fighter, just another pawn in Sterling's game. But Gabe was dangerous. He had the look of a man who would take a bullet without hesitation. "I'm not saying a damn thing," Gabe sneered. "You think you can walk in here, take me down and walk out? You're dead." Dwayne's patience snapped. "I don't need to hear you talk. I need information. You're going to give it to me, or I'll put you down right here." Gabe's eyes flickered with a mix of fear and defiance. "You really think you can stop this? You're out of your league, man. Tell me what I want to know, or I'll make you." Gabe's face hardened, but then, surprisingly, he relaxed. All right. You want to know where Sterling is? He's always got an escape plan. You hit the supply chain. He'll disappear into the wind. You'll never find him. The boss is smarter than you think." Dwayne wasn't ready to hear this. It was what he had feared. They were being set up, but they couldn't back down now. Who's his contact? Who helps him disappear? Gabe hesitated, his gaze shifting uncomfortably. Finally, he muttered, You need to talk to Royce. He's the one who handles Sterling's exits. Dwayne knew this wasn't over. Royce. Another name in the puzzle that was Sterling's empire. But it was a start. He nodded at Frank, signaling that it was time to move. We're not done here, Dwayne said, but we've got what we need. For now. The night was getting colder as Dwayne, Frank, and Isabel piled back into the truck, the soft hum of the engine the only sound breaking the tense silence. The warehouse operation had gone smoothly, until it hadn't. Gabe's reluctance to give them anything useful had been expected. But what he had given them, Royce, was the key to the next step in their plan. It wasn't a complete victory, but it was progress. Frank sat next to Dwayne in the front seat, his arms crossed as he stared out the window, deep in thought. Isabel was in the back, running through the intel they had gathered on Royce. She was quiet, but Dwayne could see the gears turning behind her calm exterior. She was a professional, that much was clear, but even she knew they were walking on a razor's edge. Royce, Dwayne muttered under his breath, the name tasting bitter. He didn't like the idea of following a trail that could lead them into an even deeper web of lies and betrayal. But there was no other option. Sterling wasn't just going to hand himself over. I know what you're thinking, Isabel said, breaking the silence. This is bigger than we expected. But that doesn't mean we back off. We can use Royce. We'll find a way to get to Sterling through him. Dwayne's eyes flicked to the rearview mirror, catching her reflection. She seemed calm, collected. Like this was just another day at the office. But Dwayne knew better. This was far from ordinary, and the deeper they dug, the more dangerous things were going to get. We can't afford to trust anyone, Dwayne replied, his voice tight. Royce, Oliver, even you. Isabel, there's too much at stake. One wrong move, and it's over. She met his gaze through the mirror, her expression unreadable. Trust is a two-way street, Dwayne. You want answers, you'll have to take risks. I don't like it either, but we don't have a choice. You want to go back to that warehouse and play cat and mouse with Sterling's men? Or do you want to finish this? Dwayne's jaw clenched. She was right. They were already this deep in. There was no turning back now. The truck rumbled through the quiet streets, heading toward the address Isabel had pulled up on her phone. Royce's location wasn't far, a high-end apartment building in a part of the city that still held a glimmer of luxury, despite the darkness of the world they were fighting against. It was a place for people who were trying to hide in plain sight, perfect for someone like Royce, who would have access to every exit, every shadow in the city. The truck pulled up to the building, a sleek, modern structure with glass windows that reflected the neon lights from the surrounding area. Dwayne could see the faint outline of Royce's car parked near the entrance. It looked almost too perfect, too easy. Frank was the first to step out, scanning the area before turning to Dwayne. We go in quiet, take him by surprise, he said, the usual fire in his eyes replaced by something more tactical. We don't want anyone else showing up. Dwayne nodded, checking his gear one more time. Right. Isabel, you're with Frank. I'll take point. They moved swiftly, as always, their movements synchronized from years of working together. Dwayne's mind was on high alert, his instincts telling him that something about this whole situation felt off. It was too clean, too simple. As they entered the building, the lobby was almost too quiet. The soft hum of the elevator seemed out of place in the stillness. Dwayne's thoughts were interrupted by Isabel's voice, low but firm. This is it. Royce's apartment is on the top floor. Dwayne didn't respond. His eyes scanned the building. There were security cameras, but no guards. Everything seemed to be set up just a little too perfectly. They were walking into a trap, and Dwayne could feel it. The elevator doors opened to the top floor, and they stepped out, their footsteps muffled by the thick carpet. Royce's apartment was at the end of the hall, a luxurious penthouse with a view of the entire city. It had all the trappings of wealth, of someone who had made it to the top and stayed there by any means necessary. Dwayne signaled for Frank to stay back as he approached the door. He reached for his phone, checking for any signs of movement inside. His finger hovered over the button to call, but before he could make the decision, the door opened on its own. There he was. Royce stood in the doorway, a small smirk playing at the corner of his lips. His clothes were impeccable, as always, expensive, tailored to perfection. His eyes were cold, calculating, like he had already known they would come for him. "You've been busy," Royce said, his voice smooth, almost mocking. "But you're too late." Dwayne didn't hesitate. "We know you're the one pulling the strings. Sterling's going to fall, and we're going to make sure of it." Royce stepped aside, allowing them to enter. "I'd be careful with that kind of talk. You don't know what you're dealing with." Frank's hand went to his gun, but Dwayne shot him a look. Not yet. They needed answers, and they weren't going to get them by shooting first. "Tell us what you know about Sterling's operation. You're the one who handles the exits." "We know you have information we need," Dwayne said, his voice calm but demanding. Royce's smirk grew wider. "You really think you can just walk in here and demand answers from me? You think Sterling is the problem?" He laughed softly. "You're playing in a much bigger game than you realize, my friend." Dwayne's patience was running thin. "I'm done playing games. Give me what I want, or things will get messy for you." Royce looked at him for a moment, as if considering his options. Then, with a sigh, he gestured toward the sleek couch in the center of the room. "All right, Dwayne, I'll tell you what you need to know. But remember, there's always a price for knowledge." Dwayne felt a chill run down his spine. What kind of game was Royce playing? He had to be careful. Every word, every gesture from Royce was calculated. They weren't just dealing with a businessman or a criminal. They were dealing with a strategist, someone who had thought through every move. Royce walked over to the bar, pouring himself a drink. "Sterling may be the head of the operation, but he's not the one pulling the strings. He's too busy looking over his shoulder, worrying about enemies. The real power lies elsewhere, and you'll never get to it." "What are you talking about?" Frank asked, his impatience growing. Royce took a sip from his glass and looked at Dwayne. "There's someone bigger than Sterling, someone who owns the city, controls everything. Sterling may run the streets, but this other player, he runs everything else. Sterling's just a pawn in the game." Dwayne's blood ran cold. "Who?" Royce gave a small, almost pitying smile. "You'll find out soon enough. But trust me, Dwayne, you're in way over your head. You're not just fighting for control of the streets. You're fighting for control of the entire city." Dwayne's mind was racing. They thought they were taking down Sterling, but now it seemed like they were only scratching the surface. There was someone bigger, someone pulling the strings from the shadows, and they had just stepped right into the heart of that darkness. The game had just gotten much more dangerous. The tension in Royce's penthouse was palpable. Dwayne's mind raced as he processed what the man had just told him. Someone bigger than Sterling, someone who controlled not just the streets but the very foundation of the city. Who was this unseen enemy? Was it even possible for one person to hold such power, to control everything from the shadows? Royce, standing there with his drink in hand, looked almost amused by their confusion. But Dwayne didn't have the luxury of wasting time. Every second spent pondering this new revelation was a second closer to losing their advantage. "We're done playing games, Royce," Dwayne said, his voice hard. "You're going to tell us exactly who's behind this. No more riddles. We're not walking out of here until we have names." Royce set his glass down on the bar with a soft clink, his eyes calculating. "You really think you can just walk into my world and take what you want, don't you, Dwayne? You're in the deep end now. The man behind this is untouchable. No one gets to him." Frank's impatience was beginning to show. "Then why don't you make it easy on yourself and tell us who it is? We both know you're not going to walk away from this unscathed." Royce chuckled, a cold, mirthless sound that didn't reach his eyes. "Oh, I'll walk away just fine. You're the ones who are about to step into something much darker. A war you can't win." "Cut the crap, Royce," Frank snapped. "We're here to take down Sterling. Now you're telling us there's someone else pulling the strings? Just tell us who, and we can leave this place without any more bloodshed." Royce's gaze flickered to the window, as if he were considering the weight of their words. He took a deep breath and turned back to them. "Fine, but remember, you asked for this." Dwayne stepped forward, keeping his eyes locked on Royce. "Who is it?" "His name is Nolan Weaver," Royce finally said, the name falling from his lips with a certain finality. "He's not some thug running the streets. He's a businessman, quiet, discreet. He owns half of this city's infrastructure. From the banks to the construction companies, to the utilities, To the politicians, Weaver controls everything. The name hit Dwayne like a punch to the gut. Nolan Weaver. He'd heard whispers about him, always in hushed tones, always from people who knew just enough to be dangerous. But hearing it now, out loud, from Royce's mouth, made it all too real. This wasn't just a criminal empire they were dealing with anymore. This was something far more insidious. "You're telling us he's been pulling Sterling strings all this time?" Dwayne asked, his voice steady despite the storm brewing inside of him. Royce nodded. "Sterling's just a tool, a puppet. Weaver keeps him in line with money, with power. And now you've gotten too close. Sterling's been running scared because he knows Weaver's about to cut him loose. That's why he's been laying low. He doesn't want to lose the only leverage he has left." Frank stepped forward, his eyes narrowing. "Where can we find him? We're going to make him pay for everything he's done." Royce's expression shifted slightly, a flicker of something dark crossing his face. "You don't get it, do you? You can't just waltz in and take down Nolan Weaver. You're playing a game you can't win. If you go after him, you'll be putting a target on your back, a target that even I wouldn't want to carry." Dwayne's heart was racing now. This wasn't just about taking down one man. This was about an entire system, a web of power that stretched deeper than he could have ever imagined. He wasn't just fighting for control of the streets. He was fighting to take down the very foundation of everything that kept this city running. "I didn't ask for easy, Royce," Dwayne said coldly. "Tell us where we can find him. We'll deal with the consequences." Royce's gaze hardened. "You really want to do this? You're ready to throw everything away for a man who won't hesitate to bury you the second you make a move? Fine, but don't say I didn't warn you." Dwayne clenched his jaw. "Where?" Royce exhaled slowly and turned toward a sleek desk in the corner of the room. He opened a drawer and pulled out a thick folder, dropping it onto the table in front of Dwayne. "Everything you need is in there. But let me be clear. You go after him, and you'll never be the same. You'll find yourself running, hiding, just like Sterling. But worse, because Weaver doesn't play by anyone's rules." Dwayne didn't flinch. He opened the folder and scanned the papers inside. Locations, names, contacts, everything they needed to track Weaver down. This was the break they had been waiting for. But it came with a price that Dwayne wasn't sure they were prepared to pay. "You'll regret this," Royce said, his tone almost sympathetic. "I'm giving you the keys to open a door you might not want to walk through. But once you do, there's no going back." Isabel, who had been quietly observing the exchange, finally spoke up. "We don't have a choice. We need to end this, and we need to end it now." Dwayne looked at her, then back at Royce. "We'll see you around, Royce. I don't need your sympathy." Frank was already turning to leave, but Dwayne didn't move. He was still processing everything they just learned. Nolan Weaver was the real enemy, the true mastermind. And now they had a plan. Maybe not the perfect one, but it was a start. "Don't say I didn't warn you," Royce called after them as they moved toward the door. "When you start digging into Nolan Weaver's business, you'll realize that you're not just fighting a man. You're fighting an empire." Dwayne paused at the door, his hand resting on the knob. "I've been fighting empires my entire life. This one's no different." They didn't wait for Royce to say anything else. They left his penthouse, stepping into the cool night air, their minds already turning over the next move. Nolan Weaver was their new target, but Dwayne's gut told him that the path ahead was even more dangerous than they could have imagined. Isabel slid into the front seat of the truck, her fingers already typing out a message. "We've got work to do. This is just the beginning." Frank's voice cut through the silence, his tone serious. "We're not walking out of this unscathed, are we?" Dwayne shook his head. "No, but we'll walk out of it, one way or another." The truck pulled away from Royce's building, the city stretching out before them. The fight wasn't over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And now, with Nolan Weaver in their sights, they were about to dive deeper into the heart of darkness than ever before. The stakes had never been higher.